Blood ties. Death has a way of slowing time. People imagine it arrives like a storm, sudden, violent, uprooting everything in its path. But when Richard Lennox, the patriarch of the Lennox family, passed away, it felt more like a long shadow creeping across the estate. A silence that settled into the marble halls, the oak-paneled study, even the sprawling gardens that had once echoed with his voice. I was not a Lennox by blood. My maiden name, Caraway, still clung to me like an unwelcome reminder. I had married into this family, into Adrian Lennox, the eldest son. But no matter how many years passed, no matter how many dinners I hosted or charities I chaired, there was always a glance, a whisper, a reminder that I was not one of them. The funeral was as grand as one might expect for a man of Richard Lennox's stature. Black cars lined the gravel drive, mourners in tailored suits and veiled hats filed into the family chapel, and cameras clicked from behind the iron gates. The world wanted to see the dynasty in mourning. Inside, grief mingled with calculation. Adrian's siblings, Charles, the brooding middle son, and Diane, the sharp-tongued youngest, sat with stiff backs and practiced expressions. Their children clutched tissues they did not use. Their spouses leaned in with rehearsed sympathy. I sat a row behind, next to my husband, hands folded neatly in my lap. My presence was acknowledged, but not embraced. The will was to be read that afternoon. That fact hung over the service like incense, thick, cloying, unavoidable. Richard Lennox had built an empire of shipping and steel, land and legacy. His estate was worth millions. His shares in the family company, even more. Everyone wanted to know how the empire would be divided. When the priest closed the book and murmured the final prayer, I felt Adrian's hand tighten on mine. Not affection, warning. "Not a word," he whispered, his lips barely moving. As if I had ever been the one who made a scene. We moved to the study, the very room where Richard had once made his children stand straight-backed as he lectured them on duty and legacy. The mahogany table gleamed beneath the weight of papers, and at its head sat the family lawyer, Mr. Harrington, his expression grave, his spectacles low on his nose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady, "we are here to honor the wishes of Richard Lennox as laid out in his final testament." I could feel the room tighten, shoulders stiffening, throats clearing. Charles tapped his fingers against the chair. Diane crossed her arms. Adrian leaned back, outwardly calm, but his leg bounced beneath the table. Names were read, bequests listed, properties, accounts, charities endowed. Then came the shares, the real power. Harrington cleared his throat and said the words that made the air still. "To my daughter-in-law, Grace Caraway Lennox, I leave 10% of my controlling shares in Lennox Global Holdings." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the weight of every eye in the room pinning me to my chair. Adrian's hand slipped from mine. Charles's mouth tightened into something between disbelief and rage. Diane actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound. "She's not even blood," Diane snapped, voice sharp. Mr. Harrington didn't flinch. He simply continued, as though reading a grocery list. But the words had already done their work. The ground beneath me had shifted. Richard Lennox, in death, had given me something no living Lennox had ever willingly offered. Power. And I knew, in that instant, they would never forgive me for it. The study erupted the moment. Mr. Harrington closed the folder. Adrian was the first to speak, though his tone was a low growl meant for me alone. "What the hell did you do to earn this?" "Nothing," I whispered back, though my throat felt tight. "I didn't even know." "Convenient," his lip curled. Across the table, Charles shoved his chair back. The legs scraped the polished wood with a shriek. "This is absurd. Shares of my father's company handed to—" He stabbed a finger toward me, an outsider, a Caraway. He must have been out of his mind. "Careful," Harrington warned, his lawyer's composure unshaken. "This was signed, sealed, and witnessed long before Mr. Lennox's passing. The court will uphold it." "That doesn't make it right," Diane hissed. She leaned forward, her manicured nails drumming against the table. 10%. That's not a token, that's leverage. What do you even know about Lennox Global, Grace? Do you think you belong in board meetings? Do you think you can sit at that table with the directors and pretend you're one of us?" Her words stung, not because they were untrue. I didn't know the intricacies of shipping contracts or steel tariffs, but because I could already see how quickly they would sharpen those words into weapons. "I never asked for this," I said softly, but my voice was lost in the din. Charles muttered something about contesting the will. Adrian sat rigid, a storm barely contained, his eyes flicking between me and the lawyer as though calculating what my mere existence now cost him. Diane was already texting furiously, no doubt spreading the news before the echo of Richard's voice had even left the room. And then silence again, thick, oppressive. Mr. Harrington gathered the papers into his case with neat precision. "Whether you like it or not," he said, looking at each of them in turn, "Mr. Lennox's wishes are clear. Grace Caraway Lennox is now a shareholder, entitled to all privileges and responsibilities that come with that position." He snapped the case shut. "My office will contact you to arrange formalities. Good day." He stood, bowed slightly, and left the room. His shoes clicked across the marble hall until the sound faded completely. No one moved. Finally, Charles muttered, "This isn't over." He stalked out, shoulders bristling, leaving the faint scent of his cologne behind. Diane gave me one last poisonous smile. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Grace. You'll find that the Lennox name has a way of swallowing anyone who doesn't carry it in their blood." Then she, too, swept out. That left Adrian and me alone in the cavernous study. He didn't shout. He didn't break things. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, he spoke in that calm, icy voice he used when he wanted to hurt me most. "You've made enemies today, dangerous ones, and don't think for a second I'll protect you from them. You wanted a seat at the table. Fine, but don't come crying when the table collapses beneath you." He left me there, seated at Richard's old mahogany table, my reflection warped in its polished surface. For the first time, I wondered if the man I had married was about to become my greatest adversary. I pressed my palms against the table to steady myself. My heart was still racing, but somewhere beneath the fear was something else, something colder, sharper. Resolve. If they wanted me out, they would have to drag me out. And I had no intention of making it easy. The house felt different after that day. The corridors of Lennox Hall, once filled with polite civility, now carried whispers that cut sharper than knives. Servants who had once smiled hesitantly now averted their eyes. Calls from the board that used to root through Adrian never reached me anymore. Even at the breakfast table, Adrian read his paper without a word, as though I were a stranger intruding in his life. But I refused to disappear. The first night after the will reading, I sat alone in Richard's old library. The rain lashed the tall windows, and for hours I traced my fingers along the spines of books his hands had once touched. He had seen something in me, something worth entrusting with 10% of his empire. If I surrendered now, then his faith in me would mean nothing. So I began quietly. The next morning, I called Mr. Harrington's office. "I'd like copies of all documents pertaining to the shares, the trusts, and my rights as a shareholder," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a pause on the other end, then a soft, "Of course, Mrs. Lennox. We'll have them delivered by courier." That same week, I began attending charity luncheons, places Diane used to reign unchallenged. She arrived in crimson silk, dripping jewels. I came in a simple black dress, understated but deliberate. I didn't need spectacle. I needed presence. And presence, as Richard had once told me, could be more powerful than money. At the first luncheon, conversation faltered when I entered. Diane's circle of friends glanced at me, then leaned closer to whisper. I ignored them, walked straight to the head table, and offered my hand to Mrs. Langford, one of the most respected benefactors in the city. "I was Richard Lennox's daughter-in-law," I said warmly. "He often spoke of you. I'd love to hear your memories of him." Mrs. Langford, surprised, softened instantly. "He was a great man," she said, and just like that, the whispers shifted. Adrian noticed. That evening, as I returned home, he stood waiting by the fireplace. "You think you can win them over with sympathy?" he asked, his tone laced with disdain. They'll never see you as one of us." "Maybe not," I replied, unclasping my coat slowly. "But they'll see me, and they'll know I won't be silenced." His eyes flickered then. Anger, yes, but also unease. I had made my first move. It was small, almost invisible in the grand chessboard of Lennox power, but I could feel the ripples. The city was watching. The family was rattled. And somewhere deep down, I knew, the storm had only just begun. Blood ties, the quiet stirring. For days after the will was read, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Every corridor echoed with unspoken grievances. Every dinner felt like a negotiation conducted in silence. Adrian sat at the head of the table, fork in hand, but never addressed me directly. Diane, with her jeweled brooches and cutting smiles, filled the air with chatter that excluded me entirely. And yet I kept my seat. One night, after another wordless dinner, I returned to the library where Richard had spent his last years. His leather chair still carried the faint impression of his form. The faint scent of his cigars still lingered in the air. Sitting there, I whispered aloud as if to him, "They want me gone, Richard, but I'll stand my ground. For you, for me." The next morning, I moved with intention. I wrote letters, yes, letters, not emails, handwritten on fine stationery, each addressed to one of Richard's old friends, men and women who had built companies alongside him, who had attended his galas, who had once smiled at me across ballroom floors. "Richard often spoke of you with great respect. I would like to honor his memory by hearing your stories, by ensuring the causes he cared about remain supported." The responses came quicker than I expected. An invitation to tea, a luncheon at a private club, a seat saved for me at a lecture Richard used to sponsor. And I went to each one, not as a grieving widow's daughter-in-law, but as someone carrying a fragment of his legacy. At tea with Judge Ellison, an old family friend, he studied me quietly before saying, "You know they'll fight you tooth and nail, don't you? The Lennox blood runs deep." I met his gaze. "Then I'll fight with patience. Steel doesn't announce itself with noise, it holds." He smiled faintly, and I knew I had won something subtle yet invaluable: respect. Meanwhile, inside Lennox Hall, Diane's voice grew sharper. I overheard her one evening hissing at Adrian in the drawing room. "She's weaving her way into the old guard. Do you not see it? She's making herself presentable, palatable, and once they begin to side with her, we'll have a real problem." Adrian's voice was colder. "Let her. Sympathy won't save her when the board votes. She's nothing without a name, without blood." But Diane was right. I was moving carefully, quietly, laying down threads of loyalty where they least expected it. And then I made a bolder move. I began to visit Richard's old charities in person, schools, hospitals, and Arts Foundation. At one event, as photographers clicked, I laid a wreath under a plaque bearing Richard's name. When asked for a statement, I said softly, "He believed wealth only has meaning when it uplifts others. I intend to carry that forward." The next morning's paper carried my picture. Not Diane's, not Adrian's, mine. At breakfast, Adrian folded the newspaper slowly, his jaw tight. Diane's spoon clattered against her saucer. "You're enjoying yourself, aren't you?" Adrian said quietly, eyes hard on me. I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm simply honoring Richard. Isn't that what we should all be doing?" He said nothing, but his silence carried weight. The battle lines were invisible still, but they had been drawn. And I knew, in the quiet recesses of my heart, that once I made these first moves, there was no turning back. The Lennox estate had always felt like a fortress, but in the days after Richard's passing, it became a cage. Every corner hummed with whispers, every glance lingered too long. Yet beneath the weight of disapproval, I began to move, slowly, deliberately, like a shadow no one noticed until it was too late. The first step was listening. I spent mornings in the conservatory, tea in hand, pretending to lose myself in a book. But I wasn't reading. I was listening to the servants passing in the hall, to Diane's shrill laughter carrying from the drawing room, to Adrian's hushed phone calls. Information flowed through the house like a river. All I had to do was sit still and let it wash over me. One afternoon, Martha, the head housekeeper, came to collect the tea tray. She served this family longer than I had even known them. I caught her hand gently before she left. "You must have so many stories of Richard," I said softly. Her eyes softened. "More than I could ever tell, ma'am. He treated us kindly always." "Would you share them with me sometime?" A pause, then a nod. "If that's what you want." It wasn't just sentiment. It was trust. Martha carried decades of household knowledge, and soon, small pieces began slipping my way. Which cousins quarreled over money, which board members Diane still called late at night, which servants Adrian berated when no one was watching. The second step was outreach. Richard had built connections beyond the Lennox bloodline. Judges, philanthropists, business partners. They remembered me not as a Caraway outsider, but as the quiet woman always at Richard's side during galas, attentive and gracious. I leaned into that memory, writing careful letters. Handwritten, dignified, never desperate. At luncheons, I listened more than I spoke. At teas, I asked about their families, their memories of Richard. Gradually, I wove myself into their conversations as more than an afterthought. At one such gathering, Judge Ellison, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, leaned forward and said, "Diane always struck me as hungry. Too much for her own good. You grace your steady, I respect that." Respect, the first brick laid in a wall of quiet alliances. The third step was visibility. I didn't challenge Diane or Adrian openly. That would have been foolish. Instead, I appeared in places Richard had cared for, his charities, his foundations. At the Lennox Children's wing of the hospital, I stood beside Richard's plaque, laid flowers, and spoke softly to the gathered press. Richard believed true legacy is not in titles, but in kindness that outlives us. That is what I will honor. The photograph appeared in the paper the next day. My face, solemn and composed, beneath the headline, "Caraway Widow Carries on Richard Lennox's Legacy." At breakfast, Diane's spoon clinked against porcelain. Adrian folded the paper with deliberate calm. "You're making quite the show," Diane said, her voice edged with disdain. "I'm keeping his promises," I replied simply, sipping my tea. But I saw the flicker in Adrian's eyes. He was beginning to notice. And then came the unexpected ally. I found him one evening in the library, Daniel Lennox, Richard's estranged nephew. He had left the estate years ago after a bitter argument with Diane, written off as unreliable, a black sheep. But now he leaned against the bookshelf with a glass of scotch, watching me. "You don't belong here," he said flatly. "Neither do you," I answered. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then he chuckled. "Fair point, but at least I know how these vipers think. If you're planning to survive them, you'll need more than polite teas and flowers." I studied him. Daniel was trouble, yes, but trouble with insight. And in that instant, I realized sometimes the most valuable allies are the ones your enemies dismiss. So I smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we should talk." The war had not yet begun, but my lines were drawn. Quietly, piece by piece, I was preparing my ground, and neither Adrian nor Diane could see how much stronger I was becoming. The blow came on a Monday morning. I woke to Martha knocking at my door, her usually steady voice carrying a tremor. "Ma'am, you'll want to see the paper." I pulled on a robe and took the folded newspaper from her hand. And there it was, splashed across the society pages. "Caraway Widow Clings to Lennox Legacy, Opportunist or Devoted." The article dripped with venom. I was painted as a hanger-on, a desperate woman using Richard's death for attention. It listed the luncheons I'd attended, the charities I'd visited, and twisted them into performances meant to curry favor. Worst of all, it quoted anonymous family sources who claimed I had manipulated Richard in his final days to secure influence. I didn't need to guess who fed them that story. At breakfast, Diane sat in her usual place, jeweled fingers resting on her teacup, eyes glittering with satisfaction. Adrian read the financial section as though nothing had happened. "Quite the headline," Diane said sweetly. "Though I can't say I'm surprised. You've been awfully visible for someone still in mourning." I met her gaze, calm. Richard believed legacy wasn't meant to be hidden. I'm carrying that forward. Her smile sharpened. Or perhaps you're carrying yourself forward. Don't delude yourself, Grace. This family tolerates you, nothing more. I placed my napkin on the table, steady hands betraying none of the fire inside me. If you think gossip will silence me, Diane, you've miscalculated. It only shows how afraid you are. The air grew taut. Even Adrian glanced up, his expression unreadable. Later that day, the calls began. Friends, acquaintances, even one of Richard's old colleagues. Each conversation started the same way. I read something troubling in the paper. I listened, answered with grace, and never once raised my voice. Yes, I saw the article, but Richard's legacy speaks for itself. I'm simply honoring it. What Diane didn't realize was that her strike, meant to humiliate me, had given me a platform. People now spoke of me, asked about me, watched me. Some with suspicion, yes, but others with curiosity. And curiosity, carefully managed, could turn into support. That evening, Daniel found me in the library again. He tossed the newspaper on the desk between us. You see what they're doing. They'll paint you as the outsider until no one listens. I looked up at him. Then I'll give them a story they can't twist. Daniel smirked. Careful, Grace, that sounds like strategy. It is. In the drawing room, Diane's laughter carried down the hall as she entertained guests, confident in her triumph. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't see, was that her very attack had begun to expose the cracks in her own facade. And for the first time since Richard's death, I felt the faint, quiet satisfaction of momentum shifting, ever so slightly, in my favor. For days, the article hung over Lennox's house like a storm cloud that refused to break. Every room seemed to carry a whisper. Every servant's step sounded more cautious than before. Diane moved through the halls with the poise of someone who had finally claimed the role she believed hers by right. She wanted me cornered. She wanted the whispers to sink into me, to hollow me out until I was nothing but Richard's widow, tolerated but unwelcome. But I had lived too long beside Richard not to understand endurance. His empire hadn't been built by loud victories. It had been built by patience, timing, and knowing when silence spoke louder than defense. So I wore my grief plainly but not pitifully. I attended the charities Diane thought would make me look desperate. At each one I spoke briefly, not of myself, but of Richard. I told stories of his belief in education, in hospitals, in places where his fortune had made something bloom. I let others speak his name on their lips, and by extension, mine. When people asked about the article, I smiled, calm, deliberate, just as Richard once did when facing hostile boardrooms. Grief is strange, I'd say softly. It makes people see shadows where there aren't any, but Richard's work was light, and I'm only here to make sure it doesn't dim. It disarmed them. Suspicion softened into sympathy. Doubt turned into private defense. No one wants to be seen as cruel to a widow speaking of legacy. At home, the strain showed in small ways. I heard one of the housemaids whispering near the staircase. She walks like she isn't broken. Another replied, maybe she is, and she just won't let us see it. I didn't correct them. Let the staff speculate. Rumor cuts both ways. Diane, however, grew impatient. Every evening, she watched me return from another luncheon or charity visit, her lips pressed into a thin, perfect line. Her article had not silenced me. It had not pushed me into the shadows. Instead, it had given me a strange kind of stage. One night, as the rain pattered against the tall windows, she cornered me in the drawing room. Her diamonds glinted in the firelight, cold and sharp. You think this little performance makes you invincible? She asked, voice low, each word measured. I folded my book shut and looked at her calm. I think it shows people what Richard valued. That frightens you more than anything. Her eyes narrowed. Don't mistake tolerance for respect. You're tolerated because Adrian is merciful and because Richard's memory still lingers. But this family has a way of expelling what doesn't belong. Then perhaps, I replied, voice steady, you should be more certain of who belongs and who doesn't. For a flicker, I saw it, the hesitation behind her eyes. the fear that perhaps she had overplayed her hand. She left the room without another word. The silence she left behind wasn't victory, not yet, but it was survival, and sometimes survival is its own kind of weapon. The days after Diane's warning passed like a slow tide, uneventful on the surface, but beneath, the currents shifted. At luncheons, I noticed how people approached me with caution at first, testing the ground before offering a polite smile. I never forced my presence on them. Instead, I let them lead the conversation, let them unburden their doubts, and when they spoke Richard's name with reverence, I added only enough warmth to remind them I had loved him, too. One woman, Mrs. Halloway, leaned across her teacup with a conspiratorial whisper. "They say you were ambitious," she said, eyes sharp but not unkind. I tilted my head, as though the word didn't sting. Ambition, Mrs. Halloway, is what built Richard's schools and clinics. If standing beside him means sharing that burden, I'll bear it gladly. She sat back, blinking, then gave me a slow, thoughtful nod. It was like that everywhere. A phrase here, a glance there, a subtle softening of the ground Diane had salted with her article. At the Lennox estate itself, I walked the halls with quiet purpose. The staff, once loyal only to Richard, were testing me in their own ways. I thanked them by name, asked after their families, remembered small details. Loyalty in households like ours was not built with grand gestures, but with the currency of memory. A gardener who thought himself invisible nearly wept when I asked how his son fared after the fever. Little by little, whispers began to turn, not into open defiance of Diane, but into a cautious questioning. "She doesn't seem the way they say," I overheard one maid murmur in the laundry. Another answered, "Then maybe they say it because they're afraid of her." That night, while candles guttered in the hall, I found Adrian watching me. He stood half in shadow, the amber glow catching the sharpness of his cheekbones. His silence was heavier than Diane's threats. When I met his gaze, I saw calculation there, measured, patient, not unlike my own. "You hold yourself well," he said finally. His tone was neither compliment nor warning, but something between. "I learned from your father," I replied. Something flickered in his eyes then, resentment, perhaps, or something older and deeper. He turned away without another word. Even in that small exchange, I felt it. The lines were being drawn. Diane had struck first, but her blow had not broken me. Instead, it had given me the space to measure the board, to see which pieces might move if pressed the right way. I did not need to rush. Richard had always told me that in this family, the battle is rarely won in one blow. It is a long game, and those who play too quickly reveal their hands too soon. So I kept my silence. I let Diane think her strike had merely stung me. I let Adrian think he still held the upper hand. And in that silence, I gathered strength, not in declarations, but in the small, careful weaving of threads. Because when the storm broke again, I would need them all. I learned early that power in the Lennox family didn't sit in vaults or on parchment. It whispered in drawing rooms, moved with handshakes, and gathered in the pauses between sentences. So while Diane sharpened her words in public, I turned to the shadows, where influence was quieter but more enduring. The first thread I gathered was Harold Bennett, Richard's old solicitor. He was gray, stooped, and often dismissed as too old-fashioned for modern battles. But Richard had once told me, with a rare smile, "Harold remembers what everyone else forgets." I asked him to tea one afternoon, in a little room away from the estate's heavy portraits. He arrived with a cane and the faint smell of tobacco. For a time, we spoke of Richard, his younger days, his stubborn pride, his ability to turn every setback into a lesson. I let Harold reminisce until his voice softened with grief. Only then did I speak. "Harold," I said gently, "you knew him better than anyone. You also know this family. Do you think he meant for me to be swept aside so easily?" The old man's eyes sharpened. He tapped his cane once, a sound like punctuation. "No, Richard was deliberate. If he gave you a place, he meant it. Don't let them tell you otherwise." He offered me something then, a small envelope of documents Richard had once entrusted to him for safekeeping. I didn't open it until after he left, and when I did, I found notes in Richard's own hand. Details about the estate, quiet instructions about trusts, and a line written almost like a benediction. Grace will know what to do with this if the time comes. The second thread came from a place I hadn't expected, the staff. I had begun making small gestures, listening, remembering, thanking, and it was Anna, the housekeeper, who broke first. She knocked softly on my door one night with a tray of tea, lingered a moment too long, and then said, "Ma'am, we don't all believe what they say. Some of us remember how Mr. Lennox looked at you. That speaks louder than gossip." Her words were worth more than any article Diane could publish. Loyalty in households like ours was gold no will could buy. And then there was Edward Carraway, my cousin. He had little wealth, little influence, but a sharp mind and a fierce loyalty to blood. When Diane's slander first appeared in the press, Edward was the one who sat in my kitchen, fists clenched, and said, "If they want war, Grace, then we'll give them one. But on your terms, not theirs." He had friends in places I did not. Junior clerks, young barristers, even a journalist or two who owed him favors. Not the glittering allies Diane and Adrian boasted of, but threads that, woven together, could form something strong. I didn't tell anyone of my meetings. Not Diane, not Adrian. I let them believe I was silent, licking wounds. I let them grow careless, thinking their first strike had left me timid. But in truth, I was weaving. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit at Richard's old desk with a candle burning low and whisper to myself the promise I had made at his grave. I will not be erased. I will not be forgotten. It was not a declaration of war. Not yet. It was preparation, the quiet gathering of strength before the storm. Because storms, I had learned, are not weathered by noise. They are weathered by anchors, laid deep and silent, long before the winds arrive. Time has a way of bending when grief is raw. In the Lennox house, days blurred into evenings and evenings into silence. Diane, ever the strategist, filled that silence with noise, luncheons, whispered reassurances to trustees, and sudden visits from Adrian that felt more like inspections than condolences. She wanted movement, spectacle, a performance of control. I wanted stillness. And in stillness, I began to hear the soft murmurs others missed. It started with Anna, the housekeeper, again. One morning she brought fresh flowers to my room, violets, Richard's favorite. She placed them by the window and almost in passing said, "Strange, isn't it, how people talk louder when they think the walls can't hear them?" I looked at her carefully. "What did you hear, Anna?" Her lips pressed tight, but then she nodded. "Mistress Diane said to Adrian last night, she won't last long. She doesn't know how to play this game." Anna's eyes held a quiet fire. "But some of us know better. Some of us have seen how you weather storms." Her words stayed with me like a seed planted deep. I didn't thank her too effusively. Gratitude in excess draws suspicion. But I let her know I had heard, and that was enough. The solicitor Harold Bennett returned 2 days later, uninvited. He claimed it was to drop off an amended document, but I noticed how carefully he looked over his shoulder before entering. "You're being tested," he said in that gravelly voice, setting a folder down. "They'll try to tire you out before they strike again. Don't let them." "What do you suggest, Harold?" He leaned on his cane and fixed me with eyes far shrewder than his years suggested. "Don't give them what they want. Don't lash out. Don't stumble. Just last. Patience unnerves the impatient." And paused. Diane has never been patient. It was around then I noticed small shifts in the staff. Not open declarations, nothing so risky, but a tray left in my study with my preferred tea. No one but Richard had ever remembered how I liked it. A candle lit in the chapel each morning without my asking. A footman who lingered an extra second to open a door, as though to say, "I see you still belong here." Diane noticed, too. Not the gestures themselves, she was too lofty for that, but the way silence lingered after she left a room. The way her words fell a little flatter among those she believed loyal. I saw it in her eyes one evening at dinner, when she caught Anna glancing toward me before answering a question. Diane's smile never faltered, but her grip on her glass was too tight, the crystal trembling faintly in her hand. Meanwhile, I kept my own counsel. I spent long evenings at Richard's desk, writing nothing, just running my hands over the grain of the wood. It was there Edward Carraway found me one night. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that sharp gaze of his. "You're letting her think she's winning," he said. "Am I not?" I asked. Edward smirked. "No, you're building. Slowly, I can see it. Others will, too. And when she realizes what you've done, it will be too late." I said nothing, but I felt the truth of it settle in my bones. By the end of the first month, the estate felt different. No declarations, no banners, no war yet, but like the air before a storm, heavy with something unsaid. Diane, for all her calculation, began to sense it. She moved through the halls faster now, her voice carrying sharper edges. At luncheons, her laughter came a touch too loud, as if she were trying to drown something out. And once, late at night, I passed her in the corridor outside Richard's study. She was standing there alone, one hand pressed against the closed door. She startled when she saw me. For the first time since his death, her mask slipped, just for a second. I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. Then it was gone. But it was enough. I returned to my room that night and whispered into the quiet. She feels it. She knows the ground beneath her isn't steady. And it is I who will move. It is the ground itself that will shift under her feet. The second move came like a crack in a mirror. Sudden, deliberate, and meant to distort everything it reflected. It was the evening of the Lennox Trust benefactors. Dinner, a yearly tradition Richard had loved, where benefactors of the family's charitable foundation gathered under chandeliers, their laughter echoing through halls lined with portraits of Lennox ancestors. Diane had insisted the event go forward despite his passing. "In Richard's honor," she said sweetly, though anyone who looked closely could see the steel beneath her words. I suspected she had plans, but even suspicion could not prepare me for what unfolded. I entered the grand hall with Edward at my side, my black dress simple yet deliberate, my presence quiet but undeniable. Eyes turned, some warm, some curious, some narrowed in calculation. And then Diane made her move. She rose at the center table, crystal glass in hand, her voice carrying with that perfect mixture of poise and practiced grief. "Friends, benefactors, loyal companions of this house, tonight we gather not only to honor my late husband's memory but to look ahead. For though Richard is gone, the Lennox name, its legacy, and its obligations remain. And it falls upon us, the blood of this family, to safeguard that legacy." The room hushed. I felt the words land like stones in still water. Us, the blood, not me, not the widow who is only tethered by marriage. But Diane wasn't finished. "Already," she said, her eyes sweeping the room before pausing, ever so briefly, on me, "there are those who believe they might steer what Richard built. Those who were not born of Lennox blood. And though I honor their grief, I must remind us all, legacy is not sentiment. Legacy is strength, duty, and blood." The words rippled through the hall. A few heads nodded. Some frowned. And others turned to look at me, gauging my reaction like spectators at a duel. I felt Edward shift beside me, but I laid a hand on his arm. Not yet. I raised my glass only when Diane had finished, her toast swallowed by a brittle silence. "To Richard," I said simply. My voice was quiet, but it carried, clean and unshaken. "A man who believed loyalty was not bound by blood, but by love, by honor, and by truth. May we prove ourselves worthy of what he gave us." The words weren't a counterstrike, not yet. But I saw the flicker of unease in a few faces, benefactors who remembered Richard's own speeches, who remembered that his love of legacy was always intertwined with compassion. Diane's lips tightened. She had expected me to bristle, to stumble, to defend myself clumsily. Instead, I had placed Richard's own values like a mirror against her words. Later that evening, as guests drifted to carriages and conversations thinned, Edward leaned close to me. "You gave them something to think about," he murmured. I watched Diane across the room, her smile stretched thin, her laughter louder than it should have been. She looked triumphant to those who wanted to see her win, but beneath it, I sensed something else. A calculation disrupted. "She thinks she's drawn first blood," I said softly, "but she's only shown her hand. That night, as I returned to Richard's study, Anna met me in the corridor. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded. "Then you know." Anna said, lowering her voice. "The house is watching. We all are, and not all of us will follow where she leads." Her words settled into me like a promise. For the first time, I felt the tide shift. Diane's strike was bold, but it had also made the quiet war visible, and visibility was dangerous for her. The morning after Diane's carefully staged dinner, the Lennox house seemed unchanged to an untrained eye. Servants went about their routines, the estate staff moved briskly through the halls, and Diane's voice carried from the parlor as she held court over breakfast. But beneath it all, there was a current, subtle and shifting, a house waiting to see where its loyalties might safely land. I didn't go to breakfast. Instead, I sat in Richard's study, the door half open, the light spilling across the desk where his notes and papers still lay as if he'd rise any moment to continue his work. The silence was purposeful. Diane could fill a room with her presence, but sometimes absence spoke louder. By withdrawing from her performance, I left space for others to wonder, why? What did I know that she did? And in that space, the house began to lean toward me. The first came quietly. Anna, her eyes alert, her voice low. "You should know, some of the staff weren't impressed last night. They thought Mrs. Lennox," she still called Diane that, "was cruel." "Cruel," I repeated softly. "She made it sound like you had no right to even sit in the room." Anna hesitated, then leaned closer. "But they remember how Richard trusted you, how you carried yourself when he was sick when she wasn't here. They see the difference." I placed my hand lightly over hers. "That matters more than you know." Next came Edward. He found me walking in the gardens later that week, his cane tapping the stones. "You're holding back," he said without preamble. "Would you have me swing wildly?" I asked. He studied me for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "No, you're right to wait, but waiting is not the same as doing nothing." "I'm not idle," I replied. My gaze drifted to the rows of trimmed hedges, the roses blooming despite the season's chill. "I'm listening, watching. Diane believes she commands loyalty, but loyalty isn't demanded, it's given, and it can be withdrawn." Edward's lips curved in a thin smile. "Richard would have approved." My counter was not one move, but many, small, careful steps stitched together. A quiet word to the solicitor Richard had trusted, reminding him of letters Richard wrote before his passing, letters about fairness, about ensuring his wife was not cast aside. A private tea with Mrs. Alcott, the oldest benefactor of the Lennox Foundation, where I listened more than I spoke, allowing her to reminisce about Richard's kindness. A short note to the estate's steward, thanking him for his loyalty and reminding him of Richard's oft-repeated phrase, "The family is bigger than blood." Each step left no trace, no confrontation. Yet slowly, the threads Diane had tried to weave into a net began to loosen. And then the subtle leak. A journalist from the Herald, a man Richard had once trusted for an honest piece on his philanthropy, reached out. He'd heard whispers of division in the Lennox house. He asked if I wished to comment. I did not. Instead, I left him with a single phrase. "Richard always believed legacy was measured by the lives you touch, not the name you bear." When the article appeared days later, it was not a scandal. It was a story of Richard's vision, of his widow keeping faith with his values. Diane was not mentioned, but the absence itself was sharp. The silence of that omission cut deeper than an accusation could. That evening, as I passed through the corridor, I caught the glance of one of the younger footmen. He bowed slightly, not just in duty but in something else. Respect, choice. Anna found me later, her voice hushed with excitement. "She's angry, Mrs. Lennox. The article, it made her furious. She says you're manipulating sympathy." I smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps the truth simply doesn't suit her. Grace's counter had begun, not loud, not yet, but enough to unsettle Diane's footing. The house was no longer leaning only her way. The silence around me was no longer isolation. It was alliance. And Diane, Diane could feel it. It came sooner than I expected. The air in the Lennox house had grown taut with unspoken divisions, whispers in the halls, glances traded over teacups. Diane must have felt it. She thrived on control, and when it slipped, she snatched harder. The setting was small, almost intimate, a luncheon with select trustees of the Lennox Foundation. The room smelled of roasted lamb and polished wood, the kind of gathering Richard had once conducted with effortless warmth. I sat quietly at one end of the table, my place modest but secure. Diane, however, could not stomach my presence. She began with smiles, as always, her voice ringing clear as she praised Richard's commitment to the family name. But then her tone shifted, sharp as glass. "It pains me," she said, setting down her fork with theatrical delicacy, "that not everyone at this table shares that same loyalty. Some," and here her eyes flicked to me with venom barely veiled, "insert themselves into matters that are not theirs, clinging to my husband's legacy as though they had any rightful claim." The room stilled, utensils paused midair. "Diane," murmured one trustee, "perhaps this is—" "No," she snapped, the polish cracking. "It must be said, Grace Carroway was a guest in my husband's life, a guest, nothing more, and yet she seeks to wrap herself in his memory to tug at your sympathies as though she were his equal. I won't have it. I won't allow it." Her voice had risen, hot and shaking. The mask was gone, the room saw her raw for the first time. I sat very still, the blood thrumming in my ears, but I did not answer. Not then. Instead, I let the silence do my work. Silence, and the faces of the trustees, many of whom shifted uncomfortably under Diane's fury. "Grace doesn't belong here," she pressed on, reckless now. "She was his companion, nothing more. To pretend otherwise is an insult to this family, to me, to the very name Lennox." Gasps rippled along the table. Even those who disapproved of me recoiled at her choice of words. Richard's death was still raw. To cast his memory in the dirt while lashing at me was a wound to all of them. At last, Edward cleared his throat, his cane tapping the floor. "Diane," he said, his voice steady as stone, "you dishonor Richard with this display." Her head whipped toward him. "You dare." "I dare," he said simply, "and I am not alone." He looked to the others. I followed his gaze. Their eyes were not on Diane now. They were on me. I said nothing until after the luncheon, when Anna found me in the corridor, breathless. "She's undone herself," she whispered. "They saw her for what she is." Perhaps. But I knew Diane well enough to understand. A reckless strike rarely ends the battle. It only means the war is about to grow more dangerous. I did not answer Diane that day. Her words hung in the air like smoke, choking the room long after she stormed out. The trustees muttered to themselves in the dining hall, shifting uncomfortably, some offended by the spectacle, others too wary to speak. But I had seen it in their eyes. She had overreached. She had given me what I could never have taken by force, doubt in her leadership. So I chose silence. Silence sharpens like a blade when wielded with care. Instead of defending myself, I visited each trustee separately in the days that followed. Not with pleas or arguments, never that, but with small gestures Richard himself might have approved. A hand-delivered note of thanks for their service to the foundation. A quiet inquiry about their health. A memory shared. "Richard once told me how much he admired your judgment on the orphanage project. He trusted you deeply." These were not counterattacks. They were reminders. Reminders of Richard, reminders of stability, reminders of me as something more than Diane's caricature. And then I let the whispers work for me. It was Anna who first told me. "They're talking," she said one evening as we sat in the dim light of the library. "Not about you, about her. They wonder if grief has unbalanced her, if she's fit to carry the family's name forward. She's undone herself." I nodded, though I knew it was only the beginning. Diane's rage had cracked the veneer, but rage alone is rarely enough to ruin someone like her. She would recover, spin a story, dress her venom in silk again. So I waited. And then the cracks deepened on their own. A week later, one trustee came to me privately. His voice was low, uncertain. Grace, I was present at that luncheon. Forgive me, but it was unseemly. Diane does not speak for all of us. Some of us still remember Richard's regard for you, if you should ever need. He trailed off, but I heard the promise in his pause. Quiet allegiance. One by one, others followed. Not a flood, but a trickle. Each ally gained not by declaration, but by their own revulsion at Diane's recklessness. I gave them nothing dramatic to seize, only calm, measured dignity. They filled the silence with their own conclusions. When next we crossed paths at a board meeting, Diane arrived dressed in pearls and hauteur, her smile forced wide. She looked at me like one studies a rival queen across the chessboard. I said nothing, only inclined my head in cool greeting. But around us, the air had shifted. She could sense it, though she would never admit it. The tide she once commanded was no longer solely hers. It was not anger I carried into my lawyer's office. It was resolve. The kind Richard would have recognized. Rachel, my attorney, had been one of Richard's old acquaintances, sharp-minded, discreet, and entirely unawed by theatrics. She sat across from me in her narrow office, papers stacked in quiet towers at her elbows. "Tell me everything," she said, her pen already poised. So I did. Not the slander fades, like smoke in a storm, but the details Richard had shared in those long months of illness. The Foundation's charter, the trusts he had spoken of but never revealed, the files he had asked me to read when his hands shook too much to hold them. Rachel listened. Then she pulled out a folder of her own. "Your sister-in-law believes she inherited absolute control. She hasn't read closely enough. Richard left clauses, not obvious ones, buried deep in the structure. He gave you far more authority than anyone realizes." She slid a document across the table. My eyes caught on a line halfway down the page. "In the absence of the founder, decisions of the board may not proceed without the concurrence of both the surviving spouse and eldest child." I blinked, but Diane is the eldest. "Yes," Rachel said, her lips curving slightly, "and you are the surviving spouse. One cannot act without the other, which means she cannot move without you." The words settled like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward. For weeks, Diane had wielded her fury unchecked, believing she was sole heir to Richard's power. But with a single clause, written in her father's own hand, she was suddenly tethered to me. Every signature, every vote, every shift of the foundation now needed my consent. And she didn't know it. Rachel tapped the paper. "We don't use this yet, not until she commits herself publicly. Let her show her hand. Let her gather allies, let her speak with arrogance. When she believes she's won, we'll bring this forward, quietly, formally, irrefutably." I left Rachel's office with the document folded in my coat pocket, a small flame hidden from the wind. The next week, Diane struck again, loud, reckless, declaring in front of the trustees that she intended to dissolve one of Richard's scholarships. "It drains resources," she announced. And frankly, Father's sentimentality blinded him to its inefficiency. Murmurs rippled around the table. She basked in it, mistaking silence for assent. That was when I spoke, my voice calm, deliberate. "I'm afraid you can't." Diane turned, lips curling. "Excuse me." I laid the paper on the table, sliding it forward as Rachel had shown me. Clause 27 of the Foundation Charter. Decisions require the joint agreement of both myself and the eldest child. I do not agree. Therefore, your proposal cannot move forward. The room fell silent. A trustee leaned forward, reading the clause with growing astonishment. Another adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking between us. Diane's face drained of color. She tried to laugh, brittle and false. This is absurd, you're twisting words." But the clause was in her father's handwriting. Signed, dated, witnessed. No twist, just law. For the first time since Richard's funeral, the power shifted, subtly, silently, but entirely. Diane's authority had been broken not by argument, not by spectacle, but by her own father's foresight. And I, the widow she called, just an in-law, was now the one holding the gate. The silence in the boardroom lingered far longer than Diane could tolerate. She laughed again, sharp, brittle, a sound that belonged more to a cornered animal than a woman of breeding. "You're misinterpreting Father's words," she said, her fingers white around the arm of her chair. "It's a technicality, nothing more. Father never meant for her," the words spat like poison, "to hold veto power over the foundation." But no one answered. The trustees, men and women who had known Richard Lennox for decades, kept their eyes on the paper, on his handwriting, on the signature. Finally, Mr. Ballantyne, the oldest of them, cleared his throat. His voice trembled with age, but not with uncertainty. "Your father drafted this with me present. He was deliberate. He wanted protection. A safeguard, we all remember." I said nothing. I didn't need to. Diane's eyes darted around the table, looking for allies. She found none. The foundation's wealth had always been her father's domain, his respect, his reputation, his careful stewardship. To oppose what he had written was to stand against his ghost. Her fury simmered, masked with a brittle smile. "Very well. If this is how you want to play it, Grace, we'll see how far you get." Her gaze cut across the table, sharp enough to draw blood. I met it with stillness, folding the paper back into my folder as though it were any other routine matter. My silence enraged her more than any retort could have. When the meeting adjourned, I walked out to the marble foyer, the trustees' murmurs following behind me like a tide. Diane stormed past, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. She didn't look back. But I saw her reflection in the glass doors before she vanished onto the steps outside. Her jaw clenched, her hands fists at her sides. The storm was coming. That night I sat in Richard's study with the fire low and steady. His books still lined the shelves, his scent lingered faintly on the leather chair. I thought of his voice, low and tired near the end. "They'll try to strip you bare, Grace. Don't let them. I built this house to endure. You're part of that endurance." I ran my fingers over the clause again, the ink slightly faded but resolute. For the first time since his death, I felt him beside me, not as absence, but as shield. Diane would not stop. She would rage, she would scheme, she would call on every whisper of influence she could muster. But she had struck loudly and foolishly today, while I had answered with precision. The balance had shifted. And in the quiet, I understood. The quieter my steps, the heavier they would fall. 2 days later, the first shot came. I wasn't watching the morning news. It was Mr. Ballantyne who called. His voice was grave. "Grace, turn on Channel 4. The headline blared across the screen. "Elian and OX fortune under dispute. Foundation in crisis." And there she was, Diane, sitting upright in her drawing room, pearls around her neck, hair lacquered into place. Her voice trembled with feigned grief. "My father was a man of integrity," she told the camera, every word aimed to wound me without numbing me. "But in his final days, when he was weakest, certain individuals manipulated him. They whispered in his ear, swayed his judgment, and now they seek to claim control over his life's work. I won't allow it. I owe it to him, and to the family name, to stand firm." The reporter leaned forward. "And who are these individuals?" Diane's lips curled in the faintest smile. "I think we all know." It was a broadside delivered in front of the entire city. Not a courtroom, not a boardroom, but the evening news. She was reckless enough to try and turn public opinion into her weapon, to smear me before the legal dust had even settled. Calls poured in. Allies, friends, even distant relatives, all demanding answers, some wavering, some already convinced by her venom. Diane knew how to move hearts by appealing to loyalty and grief, even if it meant burning truth to ash. But I didn't rush out to match her volume. That was what she wanted, me dragged into the mud of spectacle. Instead, I called my lawyer. "We'll wait," I said quietly. "And when the time comes, we won't speak in headlines, we'll speak in evidence." Still, in the stillness of that night, alone in Richard's study, I allowed myself one moment of fury. I poured a glass of his scotch, stared into the fire, and whispered to the silence. "You've made your move, Diane. Reckless, public. Now everyone will see how far you're willing to fall." The papers the next morning ran with her story. My name wasn't written, but it didn't need to be. The implication was enough. The manipulator, The interloper, the woman who schemed in shadows. But I knew something Diane didn't. Recklessness leaves footprints, and I had already begun following them. The news cycle fed on Diane's words like wolves on bone. By noon, the Lennox name trended across every column and screen. Pundits spoke of unseemly disputes. Anonymous sources close to the family fanned flames of scandal, and headlines sharpened themselves against my dignity. Widow or usurper, QSDONS Cloud Grace, Elian and OX Place. At the Lennox Foundation, staff avoided my eyes. Their greetings were stiff, their smiles brittle, as though afraid that even a word of warmth might be twisted into complicity. Secretaries whispered in corners. 2 junior trustees canceled our meetings that week without explanation. Even the florist who tended our gardens for years had faltered when I walked by, her hands pausing mid-arrangement, as if my presence carried some contamination. That was Diane's weapon, not evidence but suggestion. She'd given the world an idea that I had manipulated Richard's dying mind and let it fester. She didn't need to prove it, she only needed the city to entertain it. The phone calls came next. "Grace," murmured Mrs. Harland, one of Richard's old allies on the board, "I don't want to believe these things, but surely you understand how this looks." Then another, sharper. "You must think of the family's legacy, dear," warned one of the Lennox cousins. "It isn't just about money, it's about honor. Do you really wish to pit yourself against blood?" And late at night, in a whisper soft as betrayal, came the call from someone I had once thought of as a friend. "I won't testify for you. I can't. Diane's right, this will destroy us all if it isn't contained." Every refusal, every doubt, pressed against me like stones in my pockets, meant to drag me under. But I didn't thrash, I didn't shout back, I let the current swirl. I sat at Richard's old desk, the papers stacked neatly before me, and read through his letters in his own hand. Each one was a lifeline. His trust, written in ink, was not something Diane could rewrite on a television screen. I reminded myself of what mattered, the truth. And the truth does not panic. The truth waits. The truth endures. So when Mrs. Ballantyne, the family housekeeper for 30 years, slipped into my study that evening with trembling hands and eyes full of tears, whispering, "Don't let her do this to his memory, Mrs. Grace, I'll stand with you," I only nodded. Quiet allies, that was how the tide would turn. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through patience, through precision, through loyalty that Diane's recklessness could never command. Still, I knew Diane would not stop here. Recklessness is a hunger, it feeds on itself. She would strike again, louder, wilder. And when she did, her noise would make the silence of my answer all the more devastating. It came on a Sunday morning. The world still clutched its coffee when the headlines bloomed, poisonous and bright. Secret letter, EXPOSES widow's scheme. Insider claims, Richard Elian and OX was pressured in his final days. Diane had gone further this time. Not whispers, not innuendo. She had conjured paper. The so-called letter spread across every outlet, typed words claiming to be Richard's last private confession. In it, he wrote of being manipulated by Grace into signing documents I no longer understood, of pressure when I was weak, of the betrayal of my own bloodline. Of course, I knew every syllable was forged. Richard had written to me by hand until his last day, shaky script but unmistakably his. He never used a typewriter, never dictated outside his lawyers. But the damage was never about truth. It was about spectacle. By noon, the networks were breathless. Legal analysts spoke of grounds for criminal inquiry. A parade of unnamed insiders nodded along. The city buzzed with scandal. How convenient that such a letter appeared just as Diane moved to challenge the estate. Even the church pews were not spared. That morning, as I slipped into my seat, I felt eyes slide toward me. Pity in some, suspicion in others. Whispers curled between hymnals like smoke. "Did you see? Did you read?" Then the phone rang. It was Margaret Harland again, the wavering ally, her tone sharper now. Grace, if you don't answer this, you'll lose everything. The letter, how could you let something like this exist? And from a trustee, colder still. I warned you, this is not a fight you can win. Step aside before the courts take more from you than just property. I listened, I did not argue. But in the privacy of my study, I felt the fire build behind my ribs. The recklessness of it, the sheer arrogance. To put false words into Richard's mouth, to desecrate his memory just to stain mine. It wasn't only strategy, it was desecration. And in that moment, Diane revealed more than she concealed. Her hand was too eager, too sloppy. Already I saw the seams, the phrasing that Richard would never use, the timing of the so-called letter, the convenient leak just before the preliminary hearing. When recklessness burns too hot, it leaves ash behind. And ash can be sifted, traced, turned back against its maker. That night, as the city argued over the letter, I gathered my counsel. Quiet voices filled the study, a lawyer with keen eyes, an investigator who knew the underbelly of forged documents, Mrs. Ballantyne with her stack of old, handwritten notes from Richard, each one a weapon in disguise. "Let her shout," I said at last, my voice steady though my heart beat like a drum. "The louder she screams, the easier it will be to show the world what she truly is." And somewhere in the depths of the city, I knew Diane was smiling, thinking her strike had landed, thinking the world was hers. But she didn't hear the silence I was building. Silence sharp enough to cut. The letter did what Diane wanted. It seeped into every corridor of my life like oil into water. You couldn't hold it, couldn't wash it out, but you could see the stain everywhere you turned. At the Lennox Foundation, the board convened an informal discussion. I walked into the oak-paneled room to find familiar faces turned strange, their warmth replaced with wary calculation. One trustee, Mr. Blakely, cleared his throat before daring to look at me. "Grace," he began, voice heavy with rehearsed neutrality, "in light of recent disclosures, it may be prudent for you to temporarily step back from decision-making." "Temporarily," another echoed, though her tone suggested something more permanent. I didn't answer at first. I let their discomfort fill the silence, let them squirm under the weight of what they were asking. To admit the accusations by retreating, to surrender ground in the hope Diane's noise might quiet. Finally, I said, softly, "And when Diane publishes her next forgery, do I step back further still, until there is nothing left of me but a shadow in Richard's home?" No one met my eyes. The discussion ended with murmurs and shifting papers, the threat left to hang like smoke. At dinner parties, the whispers were worse. I stopped counting how many friends leaned too close to murmur, "You'll understand I can't be seen supporting you right now." One evening, a woman I'd known for 20 years smiled too brightly and said, "I do hope you weather this, Grace." Then, lowering her voice, "But Diane is so convincing. You must admit, she plays the part of the wounded daughter rather well." Her laughter tinkled over the clink of glasses, and I realized how quickly pity curdled into suspicion. Even family ties strained. Michael, Richard's eldest cousin, called me late one night. His voice was rough with drink. "I want to believe you, Grace, I do. But the letter, how can we know? What if Richard really did regret? What if Diane is only defending what's hers?" I listened as his doubt unraveled into silence. It was the silence of someone who wanted to stand with me, but feared drowning in the storm Diane had conjured. And through it all, I endured. I walked the halls of the Lennox estate with my head high, though servants whispered when I passed. I attended every foundation meeting, though trustees pressed papers with pointed questions under my nose. I smiled in public, though the city printed lies on every page. At night, when the house was quiet, I allowed myself a single glass of wine by Richard's desk. I read through his letters again and again, inked proof of his trust, and each time I whispered to him, "They will not erase you. They will not erase us." But the pressure was mounting. Even my allies felt the strain. Mrs. Ballantyne, loyal to the marrow, confessed in a trembling voice, "It's becoming dangerous, Mrs. Grace. Diane has people everywhere. Even the staff are beginning to question. You cannot fight her alone. She was right, I couldn't. But I would not rush. Diane had already shown her hand, loud, clumsy, desperate. My counter would be quiet, deliberate, devastating. And until the moment arrived, I would let the world think me cornered. Because cornered prey is underestimated. And underestimated prey can bare its teeth. It wasn't enough for Diane. The forged letter should have been her masterstroke, but when I did not crumble, when I still appeared at dinners, still took my seat on the foundation board, still walked the Lennox estate with quiet poise, it gnawed at her. Rumor is a hungry animal. You must keep feeding it, or it begins to turn on its master. And Diane, in her arrogance, began feeding it too much. The first sign was the newspapers. An anonymous packet arrived on the desk of a society columnist. Letters, receipts, even a doctored photograph of Richard with his arm around her at some long-ago charity event. The column the next morning read like a declaration of war. Was Diane Caraway the true confidant of Richard Lennox? Did the late patriarch confide his regrets to her, only to be silenced by circumstance? A widow may claim grief, but perhaps it is Diane who carries the genuine legacy. The photograph was grainy, the forgery clumsy, but in print, truth and falsehood weigh the same. Next came the staff. Diane visited the estate unannounced, sweeping through the halls as though she were mistress already. She promised us better wages, one maid whispered to me afterward, twisting her apron nervously. Said she'd have the power soon, that she would remember who stood by her. By the week's end, 3 servants resigned without notice. Quiet loyalty was expensive, and Diane had made sure her gold shone brighter. Then she reached for something larger. The foundation's next gala was meant to honor Richard's work. Invitations had been printed weeks in advance with my name at the head of the board. Yet, when I arrived at the printer's office to collect the embossed cards, I found a second run had already been made. This time, the name in elegant cursive script read, Diane Caraway, acting chairwoman. I held the card in my hand, the ink still faintly smelling of varnish, and for the first time since Richard's death, I felt anger ripple hot beneath my skin. Her recklessness bloomed into full arrogance at the gala itself. The chandeliers glimmered. The room was thick with silk gowns and black suits, the city's elite leaning close with their polished smiles. And then, in the hush before the program began, Diane strode to the podium as though she belonged there. Not a guest, not a grieving sister, but as if she were the rightful heir to everything Richard had built. Her voice rang out, clear and theatrical. Tonight, we honor a man who entrusted his hopes for the future to me. My beloved brother knew my devotion, and in his final months, he turned not to lawyers or contracts, but to family, to blood, to me. A ripple moved through the crowd, shocked whispers, darting glances in my direction. She smiled, basking in the murmurs, and pressed her hand to her chest. I will not allow his legacy to be twisted by those who stood beside him only for wealth. I will carry his torch, as he wished. Applause followed, uneasy, hesitant, but applause all the same. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, my glass of champagne untouched, my heart steady. This was no longer strategy. This was spectacle. And spectacle leaves cracks. Diane had overplayed her hand. The room was no longer mine to defend. It was hers to lose. At first, the applause had weight. It echoed under the crystal chandeliers, hands clapping out of habit rather than belief. But applause fades quickly when conviction is absent. And as Diane's words hung in the air, he entrusted his hopes to me, I saw the smallest fractures appear in the room. It began with silence at the wrong places. When she spoke of Richard's final wishes, no one nodded. When she claimed she alone understood his dreams, the foundation treasurer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the ledger on the table where my name, Grace Lennox, was still printed as chairwoman. At the back of the room, 2 of Richard's oldest friends whispered to one another. One, a retired judge, muttered just loud enough for me to catch. Final wishes, then where's the will? The other gave a tight, skeptical laugh. Diane always did love the sound of her own voice. Even the staff in the room betrayed her. The maitre d', who had worked our events for years, placed the champagne flutes more heavily near Diane's supporters, as if making a small, silent protest. One of the waitresses avoided Diane's table altogether, weaving a circle around her like she carried a contagion. Most telling of all was Diane's daughter, seated at a nearby table. I watched her fingers tremble as she adjusted her necklace, her eyes refusing to meet her mother. A daughter knows when her mother is pushing too far, and in her discomfort, I sensed a future fracture that Diane herself could not see. The whispers multiplied. Strange she never mentioned this before. Richard never said a word to me. If it were true, why isn't there proof? Each question slid like a blade beneath Diane's performance. The more she smiled, the more the room recoiled from the sharpness of her grin. I stood still, my hands folded, the perfect widow. I gave them nothing, no interruption, no fury, no visible wound. Because silence, when wielded correctly, is a mirror. And in that silence, the audience began to see Diane's ambition for what it was. By the time she left the podium, basking in applause that was now scattered and half-hearted, the cracks had widened into fissures. She did not notice, but I did, and so did those who mattered. The morning after the gala, the house was too still. Richard's study remained closed, its oak door heavy with secrets Diane hadn't yet pried open. I lingered in the hall, listening to that silence, then walked past it and into the smaller parlor where Richard's circle often gathered. Not to mourn anymore, but to remember him in their own measured ways. Judge Alcott was there, sipping tea as though each swallow was another verdict. Beside him, Eleanor Price, Richard's oldest confidant in the foundation, thumbed through the program from the night before. Their eyes lifted when I entered. I didn't plead, I didn't posture, I simply said, "Richard believed in integrity. That's all that matters now. You both know what was said last night doesn't match the man you knew." There was a pause, then the judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Ambition speaks loudest in the grieving hours, but truth has a longer echo. Eleanor nodded slowly. "He always told me, Eleanor, it's not who grabs the loudest that leads, it's who holds steady." I let those words settle like anchors. Then I did something deliberate. I asked nothing of them. I left the silence open, an invitation with no pressure. People are more loyal to what they choose freely. That week, I moved carefully. No grand declarations, no rebuttals to Diane's performance. Instead, I began listening. At the foundation offices, I stopped by the treasurer's desk with a quiet word of thanks for his diligence. At the hospital wing Richard had funded, I spent an hour speaking with the head nurse, reminding her of Richard's vision for care without hierarchy. At a small luncheon, I raised a toast, not to myself, not to leadership, but to Richard's work, which belongs to no single person, but to all who believed in him. Each gesture was a stitch, each word a thread, and slowly people began to shift in my direction, not in applause, but in trust. Diane, meanwhile, grew restless. I could sense it in the clipped tones of her calls, the sharpness with which she summoned allies to her home. She wanted my fight to be loud, to match hers, but I denied her that satisfaction. Instead, I had Rachel Cole, my attorney, send quiet inquiries to the registrar about the foundation's bylaws. Dry documents, easy to overlook, but tucked within them were clauses Diane had ignored in her haste. Succession required not just a claim of intent, but proof, witnessed and sealed. Proof she did not have. The whispers from the gala returned to me in fragments. A board member called with concerns. A patron asked to clarify Richard's true intentions. Even Diane's daughter, timidly, sent a note. "My mother speaks too boldly. I don't think she should." I said little, but I listened to everything, and in the listening I built. The night before Diane made her next move, I stood by Richard's study door again. I laid my palm against the wood, feeling the grain, the stillness. "You knew this would come," I whispered, "but you trusted me to outlast it." And with that, I smiled to myself, not out of joy, out of readiness. Because Diane believed the gala had given her momentum. She did not see that what she had really done was open a door, for me. The Caraway estate was never quiet for long. Even in mourning, the halls hummed with servants, advisors, and family friends who couldn't resist lingering in Richard's shadow. Diane had grown used to that hum being directed toward her. After all, she had stood in the spotlight at the gala, weaving her speech into what she believed would be gospel. But the morning after, when she descended the grand staircase in a silk robe, the hum had changed. The butler greeted her with his usual solemnity, but he didn't quite meet her eyes. At breakfast, two of Richard's business partners offered polite nods before retreating to a side parlor without inviting her in. Even her sister-in-law, who had been at her elbow all week, kept her responses clipped and excused herself early. At first, Diane brushed it aside. People were still grieving, still adjusting. But when she caught the treasurer of the foundation speaking quietly with grace by the rose garden speaking and smiling, something inside her twisted. She sent for him that afternoon. "You've been making rounds," she said coolly, offering him a glass of wine. "Quite diligent of you. Richard always valued your loyalty." The man shifted, cleared his throat. Loyalty to Richard, yes, always. Not to her. Not once did he say her name. Diane smiled, but her hand tightened on the stem of the glass until it nearly cracked. The next week, the silences became harder to ignore. Invitations to luncheons arrived with Grace's name included, sometimes even above hers. The board called a meeting, not at Diane's townhouse, but at the foundation's neutral offices. When she swept in, ready to take her place at the head of the table, she found Judge Alcott seated there already, with Grace beside him, documents neatly arrayed in front of them both. Diane smiled, sharp and brilliant as though nothing was amiss. She sat, smoothed her skirt, and said, "Well, let's begin, shall we?" But her words no longer set the rhythm. People spoke without waiting for her cue. Some glanced at Grace before continuing, a small shift but one that pierced deeper than any public slight. That night, Diane threw a crystal vase against her parlor wall. The crash silenced even her daughter, who had been packing nervously by the fireplace. "They're drifting," Diane spat. "Like sheep, like fools, letting that meek little widow plant seeds in their ears. Can't they see she doesn't have the fire for this?" Her daughter said nothing. Diane whirled on her. "You see it, don't you? Grace doesn't belong in this world. She hides behind whispers and pity. She can't survive the storm I can bring." The girl nodded, though her eyes flickered with something doubt or fear Diane couldn't tell. The truth was beginning to gnaw at her. Grace was not fighting her, not loudly, not with spectacle. And that silence was worse than any open attack because it left Diane shouting into rooms that no longer echoed back. Every smile Grace received, every ally who slipped into her orbit, was another fracture in Diane's foundation. She felt them, hairline cracks at first, then widening, no matter how hard she tried to plaster them over with charm or intimidation. Still, Diane would not stop. She could not. And as she sat in Richard's study late into the night, drinking in the scent of the cigars he'd once smoked, she whispered to the empty room. "If she wants a war of patience, fine, but I'll scorch the ground before I let her take what's mine." Her reflection in the glass cabinet doors smiled back at her, sharp, defiant, and more fragile than she dared admit. Diane's next strike came not with speeches or glittering rebuttals, but with the kind of desperation that tastes like iron on the tongue. She had tried rage and rumor. The house had not crumbled. She had tried spectacle. The room had gone cold. Now she moved into the realm where battles get decided, paperwork, the police station, the ticking, bureaucratic machinery that can stop a heart by freezing access to funds or credentials. It began on a gray Tuesday, with rain like loose coins against the windows. I was in the study, poring over ledgers and letters, when Anna pushed the door open and stood there small and damp, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "Ma'am, there's a man here asking for you. He says he's from the registry. Her voice broke. He says there's an urgent complaint, something about forged documents." My stomach tightened in a way it had not since Richard's reading. "Send him in," I said, and hid the tremor behind my voice. The man who entered wore a cheap suit and an expensive air. He introduced himself as an investigator retained by one of the trustees and produced a thin file. He did not look at me. He looked at the folder as if it were already guilty. "Mrs. Lennox," he began, speaking in clipped, practiced sentences, "we've received concerns that some documents bearing the late Mr. Lennox's signature have been altered. An anonymous source provided a copy to us, and there are discrepancies. We need to verify chain of custody. We may need to take statements." He waited, hands folded, as though he'd done this 1,000 times. My mouth went dry. Who submitted these documents? He looked at his notes. A trustee, an emergency submission. They asked for discretion. My mind ran through names like a ledger. Diane, Adrian, the ones who had stormed the loudest. I felt at once sick and stupid for being surprised. Later that morning, a pale, official-looking envelope arrived at the foundation offices. Inside, a police report. Someone, an anonymous party, had filed a complaint. Alleged forgery, undue influence, possibly fraud. Attached were copies of scanned documents. A typed confession from Richard, doctored minutes of a board meeting that showed Grace's approval of transfers she had never signed, and a copy of a notarized document that, if genuine, would have been damning. The press smelled blood. The blogs spun. Channel 4 sent a van with satellite dishes. Diane, who must have known better than any of them how to make a scandal bloom, stood in front of cameras and shook her head with the performance of a woman wronged. "Until these matters are clarified," she said, eyes wide and damp for effect, "it would be irresponsible for Mrs. Lennox to continue handling the foundation's affairs. Out of respect for Richard's name and the work he built, I have moved for an emergency injunction to protect the foundation's assets." There it was, legal theatrics, an injunction, a temporary removal. The machinery roared. Trustees quivered. 2 called Rachel Cole privately and said they were uneasy and didn't want to be involved if criminality was alleged. The bank, nervous and risk-averse, froze a small but crucial operational account pending clarification. One of the junior trustees, young, eager, fearful, told Edward he'd been approached by Diane's lawyer with a confidential note implying career consequences if he didn't cooperate for the good of the family. Diane had moved into full-blown sabotage. She had found a forger to mock Richard's hand, or she'd manufactured a witness whose testimony could be planted like a landmine. The intent was surgical: create enough official-looking danger to force Grace into paralysis. That afternoon, a detective came to the estate. He was gentle and officious at once, the sort of person who has learned to soften the blow of bad news with the right cadence. "Mrs. Lennox, we understand this is difficult. We need to take a sworn statement from you. Then we'll collect any documents you have that could clarify the chain of signatures on those papers." He looked at me with the bland sympathy of a man accustomed to ruined households. "I'm sure there's an innocent explanation." There was. My heart wanted to shout it, my head measured it. The explanations were in the handwriting samples, in Harold Bennett's custody notes, in Richard's private envelope, in the tiny, steady loop he always drew at the end of his G. Proof existed, but proof takes time. Police take forms, trustees take votes. That evening, Diane escalated in other ways. She called a closed meeting of the senior staff. And I learned, from Anna's shaking voice, that Diane had stood at the center of the room and offered bonuses to anyone who would sign a temporary loyalty confirmation. A simple line saying they would support the acting leadership pending the investigation. 3 staff members signed on the spot. 3 left. It was crass, transactional, and effective in the petty, practical ways money sometimes is. Her daughter, already fragile from the earlier public spectacle, burst into tears later that night in the servants' wing, telling Anna and the maids that mother is frightened, and she is doing what she must. The pleadings were loathsome to hear. Desperation has a way of making cruelty sound like care. Adrian, too, had joined the visible campaign. He held private calls with key directors, arranging for an emergency extraordinary general meeting. He moved behind Diane not as a timid accomplice, but as a strategist who understood when to press, and when to have smoke screens giant enough to hide rockier moves. I sat with Edward in my small drawing room, while rain tapped the panes like impatient fingers. "This is not just theater," Edward said quietly. "She's trying to pull the rug out from under you. If the injunction passes, you won't just be stalled, you'll be sidelined. And by the time your proof is accepted, they'll have replaced you." "I know," I said. The simple admission felt like putting a stone on a scale. "She's desperate. Desperation makes people clumsy. It's also loud. Loud draws attention. Attention leaves a trail." Edward nodded. "We need the trail." Rachel agreed. She moved with the kind of quiet ferocity lawyers have when they can smell a trap. "We need to prove two things," she told me. "One, that Richard's hand can be authenticated. Two, that the chain of custody for those documents is broken. If Diane or her associates planted anything, it will leave forensic traces. If the trustee who filed the complaint did so on false pretenses, we'll find their motive and their paper trail." She hired a document examiner, an unobtrusive man who loved crisp paper and light microscopes. He came with a careful temperament and an eye for the minutest wobble in ink flow. He asked for all the signatures he could get, letters from Richard in different inks, docketed papers, handwritten notes. He took samples with the solemnity of a mortician. At the same time, Rachel quietly asked Mr. Ballantyne and Harold Bennett for depositions, and asked Anna to compile a list of who had access to the study and the safe in the week after Richard's death. Anna, relieved to be asked directly and given the chance to help, produced a list that was telling. Diane had been in the study 3 evenings after the funeral, on the pretext of closing out charity lists. So had Adrian. So had one trustee, an ally of Diane's, who claimed he was dropping off condolence letters. In the days that followed, the pressure built like thunder in the chest. Trustees who had been wavering now spoke with a new, nervous deflection. An injunction application quieted the foundation's public-facing functions. Social invitations thinned. The bank held the reins on operational accounts. The press fed on rumor like a bonfire, and Diane fanned every flicker. But in those same days, the small, methodical work of forensics began to return whispers of its own. The document examiner called Rachel quietly one morning. "I can't say anything definitive yet," he said, his voice careful, "but there are inconsistencies in the typed letter you mentioned. The spacing, the letter form, these are not consistent with anything in Mr. Lennox's known typewritten work. I'd like to examine the notarial stamp more closely. The impression may be off." Rachel's reply was a single word: "Bring it." The more the experts dug, the more threads appeared that led away from me and toward those who had been loudest in accusing me. That, of course, did not stop Diane. The more evidence piled up quietly, slowly against her theatrics, the louder she screamed. She bought ads in the morning paper accusing shadow players of corrupting the estate. She leaked private snippets to a hungry tabloid. She confronted trustees in corridors. She went to the police to demand immediate arrests. Her desperation took a riskier turn when she attempted to coerce a junior trustee into falsifying a meeting minute, a minute that would retroactively ratify the decisions she claimed to have authority for. The trustee, frightened, recorded the encounter on his phone and turned the file over to Rachel rather than to Diane. That little betrayal, a secret recording, would be a clean, surgical thing in a courtroom. It would show clear intent. It would show a pattern. Everything Diane did to close the net made tiny, findable scabs on her plan. She had burned so many bridges that when one of her favored allies balked at the falsification, too much to risk his reputation, he slipped a note to Mr. Ballantyne and told him he'd been coerced. Coercion leaves marks. Lies leave voices. The week dimmed into a gray, feverish blur. There were hearings, emergency sessions where ballots were taken and minutes recorded. I sat through them with an interior of steel, present, measured, letting every look and every whisper be a data point. The journalists kept coming. They wanted spectacle. They wanted scandal. I gave them nothing sensational, only quiet composure and, when pressed, an offer of cooperation. "Ask questions. I will answer them. I have nothing to hide." And whenever Diane shouted, her voice more ragged now with exhaustion than with conviction, people heard it. They heard not the command of a leader, but the howl of someone running out of options. On a late Friday, while rain washed the city and the estate alike, Rachel called me into the study and laid the latest reports across the desk. The forensic notes. The trustee's recorded voice. Harold's testimony in which he affirmed that the real envelope Richard had given him in trust had never left his control. The dots they drew were small and not all connected yet, but a pattern emerged. Soon, Rachel said, looking up at me. Not because we're loud, but because the truth is patient. She's left footprints. Recklessness always does. Outside the study window, Diane stood on the terrace, alone, a dark figure against the gray, staring across the estate. Her face was set in lines that no smile could soften. She had gambled everything. The house was not answering with the expected fealty. She had burned the staff's loyalty and alienated benefactors. She had extended her claws and found air. This was the moment before a final collapse or a final stroke. Diane's next move would be furious and dangerous because she had nothing left to lose. Grace took a breath, closed the ledger, and prepared for it, not with drama, but with the cold, steady work that kills tantrums with truth. The air in the estate had changed. Servants whispered more cautiously. Trustees dodged calls. Even the newspapers, once eager to splash Diane's face across their pages, had begun to shift tone, printing her accusations with quotation marks that dripped skepticism. And still, she pushed. One evening, just past 9, Grace was finishing correspondence in the study when Edward hurried in, his expression tight. "You'll want to hear this," he said, closing the door behind him. "She's moved for criminal charges, directly." Grace stilled. On what grounds? Fraud, forgery, misappropriation, all on the basis of those falsified documents. She petitioned the magistrate this afternoon, and tomorrow morning the police will be under pressure to act. Rachel arrived moments later, phone still in her hand. "I've just spoken to a contact at the court. Diane's lawyer filed it at the last possible hour before close. It's a play for headlines. She knows it won't stick, but if the police knock on your door, even just to ask questions, it feeds her narrative, a widow under suspicion." Grace let the words settle like stones. She would drag Richard's name through the mud, invite scandal into his house, just to ruin me. "That's exactly what she's doing," Rachel said, voice flat. "And it's reckless, because now she's tampering with the court. Filing knowingly false allegations is dangerous." Edward added, "If she goes this far, she'll slip. People already doubt her. We just need to make sure when she falls hard." Grace nodded slowly. Her composure never wavered, but the fire in her eyes had sharpened. The next morning was chaos. Reporters clustered at the estate gates, shouting questions. "Mrs. Lennox, are you under investigation? Did you forge your late husband's signature? Will you be stepping down from the foundation?" Grace didn't answer. She walked past them with calm, every step a quiet refusal to bow. Behind her, Anna carried the satchel of documents, proof waiting to breathe. Inside, the police came politely, almost apologetically. They explained they had to follow up on the allegations. They asked for records, for signatures, for handwriting samples. Grace handed them everything without flinching. "Do you wish to comment on the allegations?" one of them asked. "Yes," Grace said. "I wish to comment that they are lies, manufactured to strip me of my rightful duty, and I will prove it." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We'll review what we've collected." When they left, Rachel turned to Grace. "This is good, painful but good. Every reckless step she takes digs her deeper. Filing false charges, pressuring trustees, these are the actions of someone unraveling." Grace's voice was low but steady. "And unraveling threads leave trails. We'll follow everyone." That night, Diane hosted a family dinner at the Caraway townhouse. It wasn't dinner so much as theater. She'd invited select trustees and allies, reporters who never refused a glass of wine, even an old acquaintance of Richard, who hadn't set foot in the estate in 20 years. She stood at the head of the long table, glass raised, eyes bright with a feverish light. "They think they can silence me," she declared, her voice sharp with drink and fury. "But I won't let her destroy what Richard built. She is not one of us. She never was. She's an interloper, and I'll see her name dragged through every courtroom in this city before I let her touch what belongs to this family." The room was quiet when she finished. Some nodded weakly, others avoided her gaze. And one trustee, nervous, pale, slipped away early, phone in hand, already texting Rachel. Because Diane's recklessness was no longer frightening, it was isolating. And Grace, waiting in silence, knew the storm was breaking. By morning, the ripples of Diane's words had become waves. What was meant to be a private rallying cry had slipped, piece by piece, into the world. A trustee's wife whispered it to a cousin over breakfast. A reporter who had been just a guest at the Caraway townhouse let a sentence drop into a draft column, veiled but pointed. Certain members of the Caraway family have privately suggested that Grace Lennox was never truly one of us. By noon, it wasn't private anymore. Grace sat at her writing desk when Anna entered with the paper. She laid it down gently, as though even the weight of it might cut. Grace read in silence. The words, sharp and dripping, carried the poison of Diane's voice. She traced the quotation marks with one finger, then closed the paper carefully. "Is this what she's chosen?" Grace murmured. Anna shifted. She didn't just choose it, she shouted it. Half the trustees were there. People are already calling Rachel. At the law office, Rachel Cole was packing when Grace arrived. "She's crossed a line," Rachel said without preamble. Before it was lies in whispers, rumors she could deny. But this is public defamation, repeated, reckless in front of witnesses. Grace lowered herself into the chair opposite. "And now?" "Now," Rachel said, eyes sharp, "we build the record. Trustees who were present will be deposed. Every reporter who attended can be subpoenaed. This wasn't strategy, Grace. It was a tantrum with an audience. And that makes it evidence." Edward entered then, his expression grim but a little amused. "I've spoken to 2 trustees already. They're rattled. One of them said, and I quote, 'If Diane is willing to burn the family name just to hurt Grace, then she's not protecting Richard's legacy. She's destroying it.'" For the first time in weeks, Grace allowed herself a small breath of relief. Not victory, just space to breathe. Meanwhile, Diane's allies began to scatter. One canceled a luncheon. Another excused himself from a committee meeting citing health. Reporters stopped calling for quotes. And late one evening, alone in her townhouse, Diane found herself dialing numbers that went unanswered. The silence pressed against her in ways that were sharper than Grace's composure ever had been. She stared at her reflection in the gilt mirror above the mantel, her painted lips, her defiant posture, and for a flicker of a moment the edges wavered. She had struck too hard, too fast, and now the cracks were spreading. But Diane Caraway was not a woman to retreat quietly. If the walls were closing in, she would claw at them until her nails broke. The house was quieter now. The gossip had burned hot, and like all fires, it left behind only ash. Diane's reckless dinner was still being dissected in drawing rooms and board meetings, but the frenzy had begun to turn, subtly, inexorably, against her. Grace, who had endured the storm with composure, now felt the air around her shift. Where once she was met with cautious, tight smiles, people now offered her the kind of eye contact that carried respect, even apology. Allies were no longer whispered but visible. Rachel put it plainly in her office one afternoon. "She's exhausted herself. That last outburst cost her dearly. The board is spooked. The trustees don't trust her judgment, and socially, she's toxic. That means we can start closing the circle." Grace nodded, though her fingers tightened on the edge of the chair. "And Richard's legacy? What becomes of it if this battle ends with rubble?" Rachel leaned forward, voice steady. "That depends on how we choose to end it. The law can give you what you're entitled to. But reputation, that's yours to manage. You can decide whether to crush Diane or leave her standing in her own ruin." Meanwhile, Diane was unraveling. Her townhouse, once filled with visitors, was empty. The phone rang less. Invitations dried up. When she walked into a luncheon, conversation faltered just enough for her to notice. She stormed into her brother's study one evening, eyes wild. "They're turning against me, Charles. Against me. She's poisoned them with her quiet, simpering act. I won't be made into a villain in my own family." Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Perhaps if you... Don't say apologize, Diane snapped. I'll never bow to her, never. Yet when the door closed, she caught her reflection in the window. A woman cornered by her own fury, trembling at the edges. Grace did not gloat. She did not strike openly. Instead, she held meetings, measured, careful, solidifying her alliances. She spoke to trustees not of Diane's failings, but of Richard's vision. She offered calm assurances where Diane had thrown tantrums. She painted a picture of stability, stewardship, and dignity. By the time the legal hearings began in earnest, Grace had already won the most important battle. The room. Judges hear law, juries hear evidence. But rooms hear tone, posture, the quiet authority of a woman who never once raised her voice. At the first session, Diane entered with a scowl, her lawyer shuffling papers in a show of defiance. Grace entered with Rachel, serene in a dark suit. The contrast spoke louder than any opening statement. Reporters noted it in whispers. Trustees took mental notes. Even Charles, sitting stiffly behind his sister, looked uncertain. When Rachel rose to speak, she didn't attack Diane. She laid out facts, documents, Richard's words preserved in writing. The will, the trusts, the stipulations. Evidence, clean and devastating. Diane tried to interject. Her lawyer objected, but the tide was already turning. Grace watched it happen slowly, like the unraveling of a tapestry. For months, Diane had thrown everything at her, whispers, smears, dinners, accusations. And yet here, at the end, all of it dissolved under the simple, surgical weight of truth and preparation. Grace's quiet war was ending. Diane's reckless one had burned itself out. The oak-paneled courtroom hummed with a low, nervous energy. The morning, the Lennox Scaraway case reached its final hearing. Sunlight filtered through high windows, catching on polished wood and the polished shoes of lawyers who knew the press gallery was watching. The rows behind the counsel tables were crowded with family, trustees, journalists scribbling furiously, and society figures who had come less for justice than for spectacle. Diane Caraway swept in first. She wore a severe navy dress, her pearls perfectly placed, her hair immaculate. But beneath the polish, there was a sharpness to her movements, a rigidity that betrayed sleepless nights. Her lawyer, Mr. Abbott, shuffled beside her, carrying folders stuffed with statements and affidavits. Minutes later, Grace Lennox entered with Rachel. Grace's suit was understated gray, her hair pulled neatly back. She carried no folders, no grand gestures, just a slim leather portfolio and a calm that drew eyes immediately. Where Diane looked like she was fighting to maintain control, Grace looked as though control had chosen her. The judge, a man with iron-gray hair and a reputation for impatience with theatrics, called the room to order. "Counsel, you may proceed." Mr. Abbott stood first. His voice was smooth, his rhythm practiced. "This case, Your Honor, is not about money. It is not about shares or wills or property. This case is about a woman," he gestured toward Grace, "who has chosen to recast herself as a sainted widow while vilifying her late husband's family. It is about vengeance, not legacy." The words rang across the room, heavy with implication. Diane sat straighter, chin lifted in satisfaction. Rachel waited until Abbott sat before she rose, her movements precise, unhurried. "With respect, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, "this case is very much about legacy. The legacy of Richard Lennox, a man who spent years building safeguards for his estate, who outlined in his own hand how his assets, responsibilities, and vision should be carried forward. The only question before us is whether those wishes will be honored or rewritten by the anger of others." The contrast was stark, one side full of heat, the other ice. Abbott called witnesses who spoke of Diane's devotion to her brother, her years of standing by the family business, her rightful place as its steward. But under cross-examination, Rachel dismantled each one with surgical precision. "You said Mrs. Caraway attended every board meeting. Do you recall this document, showing her absence from 6 out of 10 last year? You stated that Mrs. Caraway managed the Lennox Trust with diligence. Can you explain this discrepancy in expenditures under her authorization? One by one, the glossy portraits Abbott painted cracked under the weight of dates, signatures, and receipts Rachel produced with calm efficiency. The gallery murmured as each witness, once confident, faltered. Diane's fingers drummed against the table, harder with each cross-examination. Then came Grace's witnesses. A trustee spoke of Richard's explicit instructions. A family friend recalled Richard's words, almost verbatim, about Grace's judgment and steadiness. An accountant detailed the structures Richard had put in place, structures that left very little room for interpretation. But the moment that shifted the room entirely was when Rachel read aloud a letter, sealed and stored with the will, written in Richard's own hand. If there is dispute, let it be known that my trust lies with Grace. She will not act for herself, but for the good of the family and the future. Others may rage, but rage is no foundation for stewardship. The words hung in the silence. Diane's face drained of color. She whispered furiously to Abbott, who stood, objected on technical grounds, but the judge waved him down. The letter stands, the judge ruled. Proceed. Abbott, desperate now, raised his voice. Your Honor, this letter is nothing more than sentimentality. What we have here is a widow twisting grief into power, seizing control by portraying herself as the only moral figure left standing. I ask this court not to reward performance. Rachel rose last. She did not thunder, she did not even pace. She simply spoke. This case was never about performance. It was about honoring the words of the man whose absence brought us here. Richard Lennox left us a map. My client has followed it. The opposition has tried to redraw it in anger. The choice, Your Honor, is whether the map means anything, or whether rage is allowed to tear it apart. Her words cut through the silence like glass through cloth. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. He spoke slowly, each word weighted. I have heard the arguments. I have reviewed the documents, the testimonies, the letter in question. The evidence is overwhelming. Diane's breath caught. Grace sat still, eyes fixed on the bench. This court rules in favor of Grace Lennox. The estate, trusts, and business holdings shall be managed in accordance with the decedent's will and his stated wishes. Mrs. Carraway's petitions are hereby denied. The gavel struck. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Grace closed her eyes for just a moment, not in triumph, but in release. Diane's hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, her composure collapsing as whispers erupted behind her. Rachel leaned close to Grace and murmured, "It's done." Grace's reply was quiet, steady. "No, now it begins, for Richard's legacy." The sound of the gavel still echoed in Diane's ears long after the judge had left the bench. Around her, the courtroom had dissolved into movement, papers gathered, reporters filing out, murmurs swelling into chatter. But she sat frozen, her pearl necklace suddenly heavy against her throat. Her lawyer tugged gently at her arm. "Mrs. Carraway, we should go." She didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the polished wood of the judge's desk, as if sheer will could undo the words just spoken. Denied, in favor of Grace Lennox. The phrase looped in her mind like a taunt. Finally she rose, stiff and mechanical, her heels clicking against the floor as she stalked toward the exit. Cameras swiveled toward her, voices calling her name, questions thrown like stones. "Mrs. Carraway, any comment? Do you believe the court was biased? Will you appeal?" Diane raised her chin and walked past them, but her face betrayed the strain. Lips pressed thin, eyes glassy, one hand gripping her purse until her knuckles whitened. That evening, the Carraway townhouse was dark except for the flicker of lamps in the drawing room. Diane sat with a glass of scotch, though she had never cared for the drink before. Her pearls were gone, her hair disheveled, her dress wrinkled from hours of sitting motionless. Her sister-in-law tried to console her. "It isn't over, Diane. You could." "Could what?" Diane snapped, her voice brittle. "Appeal, throw more money at lawyers, parade more witnesses for Rachel to shred." She laughed then, sharp and humorless. "Don't you see, they've already won. Grace doesn't even have to fight anymore. She just has to stand there silent, and everyone calls her the virtuous widow. Her hand trembled as she raised the glass again, spilling amber liquid on the carpet. The following week was worse. Society papers published photographs of Grace leaving court with serene composure, headlines lauding her dignity. Next to those images were pictures of Diane, mid-stride, eyes flashing, jaw clenched. The captions were merciless: Caraway in defeat, the bitter sister, a fall from grace. Invitations to luncheons dwindled. Calls from old friends went unanswered or never came at all. Even her trusted allies avoided her gaze when they crossed paths in public. At the club, two women whispered behind their menus as Diane entered. She heard one of them say, not quietly enough, "She fought too hard. People don't forgive desperation." The words struck harder than the verdict. One night, Diane sat alone in her vast dining room, the long table set for no one. She poured another drink, staring at her reflection in the glass. How did it come to this? She thought. I fought for what should have been mine, for Richard's legacy, for my family's name. And still, they chose her. But beneath the anger was a deeper fear, that perhaps Richard had never trusted her as she believed. That perhaps the world saw through her polish and ambition to something brittle, something lacking. Her voice broke into the silence, half whisper, half sob. What did she give him that I never could? The question lingered in the empty house. While Diane sat in her silent dining room, clutching a drink like a lifeline, Grace Lennox moved through her own house with deliberate calm. The trial had been brutal, every detail of her marriage, every decision of her late husband dissected in public, but the verdict brought no triumph, only release. The morning after, she walked through the gardens with a cup of tea, the early sun gilding the hedges Richard once loved. Her lawyer, Rachel, joined her, files in hand, already speaking of next steps. You have options now, Grace. The estate is secure, the trust untouchable. But the court of public opinion, well, you know it doesn't stay quiet for long. You could. Grace lifted a hand gently. I don't want more battles, Rachel, not if they can be avoided. I want to restore peace for my children, for myself. I've lived in conflict long enough. There was no bitterness in her tone, only resolve. Grace began slowly but firmly to rebuild. She visited the foundation Richard had left half-finished, stepping into the boardroom with steady poise. Those who had once doubted her now leaned in when she spoke, surprised at her clarity. This isn't about wealth, she told them, her voice carrying. It's about responsibility. Richard's name deserves to mean something more than headlines about family squabbles. If I carry it forward, it will be for that. Somewhere deep down, she knew the papers would still print Diane's decline with relish, but Grace had chosen a different path. Instead of feeding the spectacle, she turned toward substance. One afternoon, as she walked through town, a woman she barely knew stopped her on the street. You've handled yourself with such dignity, the woman said softly. I just wanted you to know people see it. Not everyone, perhaps, but enough. Grace smiled faintly, touched in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her feet steady, the shadows of doubt thinning. Where Diane's house grew emptier with each passing week, Grace's halls filled with quiet purpose. Meetings, calls, soft laughter from her children. While Diane sought solace in the bottom of a glass, Grace found hers in rebuilding. The war between them wasn't about land or titles anymore. It was about legacy, about which woman would be remembered as Richard's true heir in spirit. And without striking another blow, Grace was already winning. The morning light in the Lennox home had changed. Once, it had seemed thin, strained by the tension that lived in every corner. Now it pooled warm across the breakfast table, where Grace sat with her children. Her son, Matthew, tapped at his homework. Mom, are you going to be busy again today? Grace smiled, smoothing a hand over his hair. Busy, yes, but not too busy for you. Things are different now. Different, that word became a rhythm in her life. At the Lennox Caraway Foundation offices, Grace entered the boardroom with the same quiet dignity she'd carried into the courtroom. The air shifted when she arrived, not with fear, as Diane's entrances had inspired, but with an attentive respect. Rachel, her lawyer and now advisor, placed a file in front of her. The endowment is secure, but if you want to rebuild its reputation, you'll need to be visible. Grace tilted her head. Visible how? Attend the gala, lead the projects, meet the beneficiaries. Remind everyone this isn't just about money. It's about purpose. Grace glanced around the table. Older men who had once whispered about her sat straighter under her gaze. Younger women looked at her with quiet hope. Then that's what we'll do, she said. But on my terms. No pageantry, no vanity. If we put Richard's name to anything, it will be for work that lasts. Weeks later, she stood at a groundbreaking ceremony for a new children's hospital wing. Her black dress replaced by a simple blue coat. Reporters hovered, questions sharp at the ready. Mrs. Lennox, what do you say to critics who claim this is just damage control after the lawsuit? Grace didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, deliberate. I say children's health doesn't wait for lawsuits or gossip. Richard believed in this project. I'm here to see it finished. People can write what they want. I'll be busy working. The clip ran that night, and for the first time, the public saw her not as a figure in scandal, but as a leader. Her quiet persistence drew others. At a small dinner, Richard's longtime friend leaned across the table. I'll be frank, Grace, I doubted you. Thought you'd crumble, that Diane would tear you apart. But you've proven me wrong. You've got steel. Grace smiled faintly. Not steel, just clarity. Conflict strips away what doesn't matter. What's left is enough. Rachel, sitting nearby, caught her eye and gave the smallest approving nod. Late at night, Grace would return to her study, the house finally quiet. She would sit at Richard's old desk, fingers brushing the grain of the wood, and whisper into the silence. I'm not you, Richard. I'll never be you, but I'll carry this in my way, and I'll do it clean. She never knew if she believed in ghosts, but somehow, the silence always seemed to answer. Grace was no longer surviving Diane. She was becoming something more, something Diane, in all her fury and recklessness, could never be. The steady center, the woman who weathered storms and remained whole. And that, Grace began to realize, was the true legacy she wanted to leave. Grace adjusted to mornings without Richard like someone relearning how to breathe. Her days filled with measured routines, school runs, board meetings, handwritten notes to donors. Each task, however small, layered itself into a foundation for her future. But while she built, Diane frayed. Grace sat at the long table, reviewing project proposals. Her voice was calm, her direction precise. This one, she said, pointing to a scholarship initiative, will continue. We'll double the budget. Education endures longer than estates. The directors nodded. One of them, a cautious man named Whittaker, leaned closer. Mrs. Lennox, you've brought stability here. When Diane tried to, he trailed off delicately. Grace spared him embarrassment. Diane's decisions belong to her. Mine belong to me. Let's focus on the work. A subtle signal. Grace was no longer merely Richard's widow. She was the steward of his legacy. Meanwhile, Diane slammed down her phone, wine glass in hand. Another call unanswered. Another ally gone. Cowards, she hissed. They all praised me when father was alive. Now they run to her like children to a schoolteacher. Her reflection in the window caught her off guard. Eyes tired, lipstick smeared, fury aging her by the hour. She whispered to herself, this isn't over. It's not over unless I say it is. But the city outside didn't hear her. Grace stood before a modest crowd, ribbon in her hand. Cameras flashed as she spoke softly into the microphone. This isn't about me. It isn't about any of us. It's about children who will come here frightened, in pain, and leave with hope. If you see my face on this project, I hope you'll forget it and remember theirs. The crowd applauded, moved by her humility. The clip spread quietly online, reframing her as a figure of strength. Diane attempted her counter, hosting a dinner for old society allies. But the wine flowed too freely, and her temper cracked. You sit here praising her, Diane sneered, voice rising. But where was Grace when Richard built all this? At home, polishing his shoes. Don't you see? She's stealing my inheritance." The room stilled. No one defended her. A man coughed politely and changed the subject. Diane sat frozen, realizing the strike had missed and that silence could wound deeper than words. Grace's days grew purposeful, her reputation carefully mended. Diane's grew lonely, her reputation bleeding out in whispers and silences. Grace was learning that survival wasn't enough. Rebuilding meant teaching people to see her as more than the widow, more than the quiet one, someone steady, trustworthy. Diane was learning, painfully, that rage and recklessness win you the room for a night but empty it forever after. And soon, both women would meet again, not in whispers or dinners, but in the formal, unforgiving light of the courtroom. Grace's days became quiet, deliberate acts of rebuilding. She no longer sat in the Lennox library waiting for shadows of the past to stir. Instead, she walked the estate grounds each morning, speaking with staff, asking about their families, their worries. For years, Diane had treated them like scenery, names blurred into utility. Grace, with her steady questions and genuine listening, began to turn them into allies. At the local church, where Daniel Lennox's memorial plaque hung, Grace joined committees she had once only observed from a distance. Not because she hungered for approval, but because she knew that presence was power. A widow in black silk who bowed her head in prayer was harder to vilify than a woman whispered about in parlors. Rachel Caraway, her sister by marriage and once her fiercest skeptic, began to thaw. "You're different now," Rachel admitted one afternoon over tea. "I thought you'd vanish after Daniel. I didn't expect you to stay, much less to fight." Grace's reply was soft. "I didn't expect to either, but sometimes survival requires more than retreat." She invested in quiet gestures that spoke louder than speeches, funding a scholarship in Daniel's name, restoring a local clinic with her own inheritance. Her reputation shifted from opportunistic in-law to widow holding the family together. Slowly, whispers began to favor her. Meanwhile, Diane's world shrank. Where Grace's days filled with purpose, Diane's days filled with frantic calls to lawyers, late-night meetings with allies who left with unease in their eyes. Grace didn't need to push. She only needed to endure. At night, when the estate was still, Grace sat at Daniel's old desk, ledger open, letters stacked neatly. Each page, each signature, each carefully notarized record was a brick in the fortress she had built around herself. She wasn't just defending anymore. She was preparing to win. And when the summons for the court hearings finally arrived, Grace folded the letter carefully, set it on the desk, and whispered to the empty room. "It's time." The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and nerves. Grace sat at the plaintiff's table, her black dress as crisp as the edges of her legal binder. The room was alive with murmurs, reporters craning their necks, family acquaintances filling the benches out of morbid curiosity. Across the aisle, Diane Caraway swept in like a queen who had already claimed the verdict. Her heels clicked a rhythm of defiance. Her chin held so high it seemed her neck might snap under the weight of it. She wore deep navy silk, calculated to suggest composure and dignity. Her lawyer, Gerald Pike, whispered into her ear, his smirk thin as glass. Grace didn't move. She didn't need to. She had been waiting for this day since the first strike Diane had made at Daniel Lennox's will. The judge, a gray-haired woman with no taste for theatrics, entered. "Court is now in session. We will hear arguments in Lennox v. Caraway." Gerald Pike rose first. He was smooth, rehearsed, every gesture a little too polished. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice warm as if he were comforting a child. "This case is, at its heart, about a woman scorned. Mrs. Grace Lennox is not a blood heir to the Lennox fortune. She is an in-law whose role was meant to be supportive, not controlling. And yet, out of grief, and perhaps bitterness, she has twisted her late father-in-law's generosity into a claim for power that was never intended for her. She has misinterpreted his will. She has manipulated those around her to believe she is owed what belongs, by right, to his true bloodline." He gestured to Diane, who lowered her eyes with feigned humility. It was almost convincing. Almost. Grace sat still, her hands folded, her lawyer Rachel beside her making neat notes in the margin. Gerald went on. Diane Caraway, by contrast, has only sought to honor her father's legacy. She has no interest in conflict. She is simply protecting what her father intended. There it was, the lie painted like oil across canvas, thick and glossy. Grace knew better. She had the receipts, the letters, the fragments of truth Diane had tried to bury under charm and threats. When Gerald sat, Diane allowed herself the smallest smile, just enough to let Grace see it. Rachel stood. She was not theatrical. Her voice was crisp, stripped of excess. Your Honor, members of the jury, you've just heard a story. What we will show you instead is evidence. Not rumor, not reinterpretation. Evidence. Mr. Daniel Lennox made his intentions clear, not once but several times. He wanted his legacy protected by the person he trusted most. That person was Grace Lennox. She paused, letting the silence stretch. And as this case unfolds, you will see that Diane Caraway has not only challenged that intention, she has actively sought to undermine it. Through deception, coercion, and reckless actions that do not honor her father's memory, but dishonor it. A ripple of unease moved across the benches. Diane stiffened. The first witnesses were called: Daniel's old business partner, a long-retired accountant, a nurse who had been present at his final weeks. Each one spoke quietly, confirming that Daniel had spoken of Grace as the steady hand of the family, the one he believed would hold things together. Diane leaned toward Gerald, her whispers sharp. Once or twice, she glared openly at the witnesses, as though daring them to contradict her. Then came cross-examination. Gerald stood, all silken condescension. To be clear, he said to the nurse, you're saying Mr. Lennox spoke of Mrs. Grace Lennox, what was it? As a steady hand. Yes, the nurse said softly. But that's hardly legal terminology, is it? He wasn't speaking about business affairs. He was ill. Isn't it possible you misheard? No, she replied firmly. He was very clear. A ripple of approval ran through the jury box. Diane's jaw tightened. And then, the pivot. Gerald called Diane herself to the stand. She walked with the poise of someone rehearsing her coronation. Her voice trembled only slightly as she spoke of her father, his kindness, his trust, the special understanding they had. She painted Grace as a shadow, always present but never meant to lead. My father loved Grace, Diane said, but she was never family in the way I was. He respected her, yes, but to hand her the legacy, that would have been unthinkable. Gerald smiled like a man closing a case. Rachel rose, slow as a blade being drawn. Diane, she said, her tone polite, you've spoken at length about your father's intentions. Let me ask you, were you present when he signed the addendum to his will, nomming Grace as executor of his estate? The color drained fractionally from Diane's face. I know, I was. Rachel laid a page on the evidence table. This is your father's signed addendum, dated 2 weeks before his passing, witnessed, verified. Would you like to read it aloud to the jury? The silence in the room was suffocating. Diane's lips parted, then closed again. She glanced at Gerald, but his eyes stayed forward. Rachel's voice was silk over steel. So when you say it would have been unthinkable, are you saying your father was incapable of making his own decision? Diane's hand trembled. He was ill. He wasn't himself. Interesting, Rachel said softly, because 3 different witnesses have testified that in his final days, his mind was clear, his words precise, his intent unmistakable. The jury watched Diane as she swallowed, her mask slipping by degrees. Grace sat still, hands folded. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was speaking louder than she ever could. Rachel didn't rush. She let silence do half the work, knowing the jury was watching Diane squirm. Grace, hands still neatly folded, looked on with that same quiet steadiness that had carried her through every ambush, every whispering dinner, every betrayal. Rachel paced a few steps, then stopped directly in front of the witness box. Diane, she said lightly, almost conversationally, you've described your father as generous, wise, deeply devoted to family. Would you say he was a man of his word? Yes, Diane said too quickly. Rachel's brows arched. So when he signed this addendum, when he placed his signature under the words Grace Lennox is to be entrusted with the family estate, are you suggesting he was lying? The room leaned forward. The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Diane's lips parted, then snapped shut. She adjusted her silk sleeve, her hand betraying a tremor. No, he wasn't lying. He was confused, pressured. Rachel didn't flinch. Pressured by whom? Diane hesitated. The pause was fatal. A low murmur rippled across the gallery. Grace lowered her eyes, calm, as though she'd known Diane would stumble here. By Grace, Diane said at last, her voice rising a fraction. She's always been careful with her words, careful with her image, but underneath, she wanted control. She got to him in his weakest moment. The jurors exchanged glances, some skeptical, some thoughtful. Rachel didn't pounce, not yet. She let Diane's own words fill the silence, let the image of desperation settle. Then she turned, flipping through a slim folder. I'd like to submit into evidence Exhibit 24. She held up a copy of Daniel Lennox's handwritten letter, addressed to Grace. In his own hand, 1 week before his death. Shall I read it? Gerald Pike shot up. Objection, irrelevant, prejudicial sentiment. The judge glanced over. Overruled, proceed. Rachel unfolded the paper. Her voice was steady, but something softer threaded through it. My dearest Grace, I trust you with what remains, not because you asked, but because you never did. You carried more of this family than anyone should, and you did it without expectation of return. Let the others fight if they must. You are the keeper of what is good. Do not let them burn it down. The courtroom was silent, but for the faint scratch of a reporter's pen. Diane's knuckles had gone white where she gripped the edge of the witness stand. Rachel folded the letter. No further questions. It should have ended there, but Diane couldn't hold her tongue. This is manipulation, she burst out, her voice cracking. She probably wrote that herself, or forced him to. Ms. Carraway, the judge snapped, you will contain yourself. But it was too late. The jurors had seen it, the slip, the desperation. The once boy's daughter now flailing like a cornered animal. Grace finally lifted her gaze to Diane. Not triumphant, not cruel, just steady. The kind of gaze that said, you've undone yourself. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation, as if the air itself knew something monumental was unfolding. Diane's face had gone pale. Her silk sleeves no longer a shield, but a trembling barrier against the truth pressing in. Rachel returned to the center, her steps measured, deliberate. Thank you, Your Honor, she said softly, nodding to the judge, then turning toward Diane. Now, Ms. Carraway, let's revisit some of the details you've shared. She signaled a clerk who handed her a thick binder. Exhibit 37, 38, and 42, testimonies from family accountants, household staff, and your late father's personal assistant. They all confirm one thing, that the estate was in perfect order and that your father repeatedly expressed trust in Grace. Did you contest these observations when they were made? Diane blinked rapidly. I did. Exactly, Rachel said, letting the word hang. You didn't. You chose to remain silent, even when your father's wishes were documented clearly, even when witnesses could corroborate them. Is that correct? Yes, Diane whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. Rachel paused. She leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice just enough for the jury to catch the edge of conviction in it. And yet, here today, you accuse Grace of undue influence. You suggest manipulation. Yet all evidence, from handwriting to bank ledgers, from letters to witnesses, points in the opposite direction. Why did you remain silent if you truly believed manipulation was at play? Diane's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her polished composure had fractured entirely. I thought. Thought what? Rachel pressed. That your father would correct you, that the truth would change because you wanted it to. A faint murmur went through the gallery. Diane's eyes darted to the side, seeking an ally, finding none. Rachel turned slightly, signaling another witness. The courtroom doors opened, and the late father's personal assistant, a small, meticulous woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, entered. She carried a folder of notes, each page immaculately typed and time-stamped. "Good afternoon," Rachel said warmly. "Thank you for coming. Could you please confirm your position in the Lennox household?" "I was Mr. Lennox's personal assistant for 15 years, the woman said firmly. "And during that time, did you witness Mr. Lennox discussing the distribution of his estate?" Rachel asked. "Yes," she said, "repeatedly, and every time he expressed trust in Grace. She had the understanding, the responsibility. He often mentioned that she carried the weight of the family better than anyone else." Rachel's voice softened, but every word cut sharper than steel. "So, the idea that Grace coerced him, manipulated him, or forced his hand, would you say that aligns with your observations?" The assistant shook her head. "Absolutely not. He made his choices clearly, and he always defended Grace's judgment." The gallery exhaled. Diane's hands trembled. Rachel didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, letting Diane's own denial echo against the weight of unassailable truth. "Let's turn to the household staff," Rachel continued. "Several individuals observed Diane Caraway's behavior in the weeks leading up to Mr. Lennox's death. Were you aware, Ms. Caraway, that multiple staff members reported attempts to influence, question, or redirect your father's decisions?" Diane opened her mouth, then closed it. Her voice was barely audible. I did." Rachel's gaze sharpened. "Exactly. You didn't contest them. You remained silent, even when confronted with evidence that contradicted your claims. Your silence, your inaction, is now speaking louder than any testimony you could offer." Grace's face remained calm, serene. Her hands rested lightly on the bench, unmoved by Diane's flailing. It was a quiet power, an unspoken assertion that the truth had aligned itself on her side, and no theatrics, no frantic claims could undo it. Rachel leaned back slightly, letting her final point land. "So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have a daughter who claimed manipulation, yet we have letters, witnesses, and documented behavior that tell a consistent story. A father who entrusted his estate to Grace not because she demanded it, not because she coerced, but because she earned it through integrity and steadfast care." She flipped through the folder one last time, resting it neatly on the table. "Ms. Caraway, you've accused Grace of manipulation. Today it's become clear who has been manipulated, and it was Grace. It was you, by your own assumptions and ambitions." The room seemed to hold its breath. Diane's face had gone from pale to a ghostly white. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "No, it can't be." Rachel took a calm, deliberate step back, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "The truth, Ms. Caraway," she said softly, almost kindly, "has a way of settling itself, and here it has settled in Grace's favor. The rest is merely consequence." Grace exhaled softly, her lips curving into the faintest hint of relief. Not triumph, not joy, just peace. Diane slumped slightly in her chair, the last vestiges of authority and poise stripped away in full view of the jury. The courtroom held its silence a beat longer before murmurs began to ripple through. Rachel had finished her careful, devastating work, and in that quiet aftermath, Grace, steady, composed, remained the keeper of her family's legacy. The judge's gavel struck lightly, a small punctuation to the storm that had just passed. Diane sat frozen, her hands pressed tightly to her lap, fingers still quivering. The jury exchanged one last glance before turning their attention to the forewoman, who slowly nodded, confirming what had already settled in the minds of everyone present. Grace remained seated, hands folded, shoulders unshaken. Her eyes, once scanning Diane for weaknesses, now softened, not with mercy exactly, but with a recognition that this chapter had ended in the only way it could. Truth prevailing, dignity intact. Diane's breathing had become shallow. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a broken rasp emerged. I, she stammered, clutching the edge of the stand, her polished composure fully gone. Her legs shook beneath her, and for the first time in years, she appeared small, fragile, exposed. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. the public witnessing the fall of a woman who had seemed untouchable. Diane's eyes darted around, seeking allies in vain. Her father's assistant avoided her gaze. The jury looked on with quiet judgment. Even her attorney, usually quick to intervene, sat back, realizing no words could repair the damage done by months of ambition colliding with truth. Rachel approached slowly, not to gloat, but to close the chapter decisively. "Ms. Carraway," she said softly, almost gently, "the evidence is clear. Your father's trust was not misplaced. Your attempts to claim otherwise only highlight your misunderstanding of what true responsibility looks like." Diane's knees buckled slightly. The judge's clerk moved forward instinctively, but Diane waved her off weakly, her collapse a mix of exhaustion and resignation. She sank into the witness chair, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Tears glistened at the corners of her eyes, not entirely from sadness, perhaps, but from the weight of inevitability settling over her. Meanwhile, Grace rose quietly, moving toward the judge's bench. Each step was measured, calm, embodying the steadiness that had carried her through years of whispered dinners, subtle betrayals, and relentless testing. She didn't glance at Diane. There was no need. Victory had never required humiliation, only truth. The judge cleared his throat. "The court finds in favor of Grace Lennox as the rightful executor and trustee of the Lennox estate. May the family find a way to honor what remains of their legacy." The words hung in the air like sunlight piercing through clouds. Grace nodded respectfully, offering a small, composed smile to the courtroom. She didn't celebrate. She merely acknowledged the responsibility now entrusted to her. Diane remained slumped, silent, a stark contrast to the controlled, luminous presence Grace projected. Outside, cameras flashed, and whispers followed them down the hallways. Yet Grace moved through it all with quiet authority, a woman who had weathered storms and emerged intact, carrying the weight of her family's name without compromise. Later, as the courtroom emptied, Diane lingered for a moment, staring at the empty chair where her father's legacy had been affirmed. Rachel watched her from across the room, expression unreadable. Grace approached, placing a hand lightly on Rachel's arm, not to intervene, only to acknowledge that the fight was over. Grace stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, her coat catching the autumn breeze. The streets were filled with the noise of life, indifferent and persistent. Yet in her chest, there was a quiet victory, the kind that didn't need applause, the kind that mattered most because it was earned, not seized. Diane would rebuild, perhaps, but not today. Today, Grace had carried the truth to its rightful conclusion, and that, in the end, was enough. Epilogue, months later. Autumn had turned to early winter, and the Lennox estate stood quiet, dignified, as it had for generations. Grace walked through the hallways, her footsteps echoing softly against polished floors. Portraits of past family members looked down, stern yet approving, as if silently acknowledging that the legacy was in safe hands. The staff had settled into a calm rhythm under her guidance. Grace moved among them with a natural ease, checking on details, listening to concerns, but never overbearing. The weight of responsibility pressed on her shoulders, yes, but it was steady, manageable, the kind of burden only earned through integrity and patience. Diane, by contrast, had retreated to a smaller apartment in the city. She had retained her freedom, but the sharp edges of her ambition had dulled. Some days she stared at letters, notes, and bank statements she could no longer influence, the memory of the courtroom still raw. The collapse had not destroyed her entirely, but it had stripped away the illusions she had clung to. Friends drifted away quietly, leaving her with space and uncomfortable time to reckon with the consequences of her actions. Grace occasionally received letters from Diane, carefully worded, cautious attempts at reconciliation. She read them, folded them neatly, and tucked them away. There was no rush to forgive, no need for confrontation. Grace understood that the real victory had never been in humiliation or retribution. It had been in carrying forward what mattered, with honesty and grace. One crisp morning, Grace walked the estate grounds, snow just beginning to dust the hedges. She paused near the garden where her father had once spent hours tending roses. In the silence, she felt the weight of history, of family, of choices made and consequences endured. Yet, alongside it all, she felt a quiet lightness, a sense that she had, at last, brought order to chaos without losing herself in the process. Life outside the estate continued with its relentless noise, but inside, Grace had created a space where integrity and love could thrive. Diane would have her own journey, one of reckoning and perhaps growth, but that was no longer Grace's burden to carry. And as the winter sun touched the rooftops, Grace finally allowed herself a small, contented smile. The story of betrayal and ambition had run its course. What remained now was stewardship, resilience, and the quiet certainty that she had honored her family and herself fully. Grace had won, the estate was secure, and Diane was nowhere near finished. But as the winter wind whispered through the Lennox grounds, a letter arrived, sealed, unsigned, and heavy with implication. Grace held it in her hands, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She just knew, that someone was about to challenge everything she thought she understood. Who sent it? And what secrets had yet to surface from the shadows of her family's past? If Grace's quiet strength and unwavering resolve stayed with you tonight, if her patience, her courage, her careful triumph resonated, please share this story. Subscribe to Everyday Dramas so you don't miss the next chapter of the Lennox legacy. And leave a comment below, because your thoughts and reflections are part of this journey too. The gavel may have fallen, and Diane may have faltered, but the story doesn't truly end here. The real story is in what comes next, how we carry forward, rebuild, and claim what is rightfully ours, piece by piece, after the storm has passed. Thank you for listening.